Hello everyone, welcome to What If Ichigo Was in High School DXD Part 8, Chapter 24. Treachery of the Heart. And that's all of it, Yoruichi said cheerily as she led him back around, her arms still encircled around his own. I was sick and tired of the cramped living space, so I forced Kisuke to build it all. A girl needs some wide open space to stretch her legs after all. Ichigo looked down at her with an appreciate glance. Once upon a time, his eyes would just meet the top of her head, now he had to actively look down to make eye contact. The realization had struck him once more. Nothing had changed. But one prominent thought came unbidden. But I did. None of that looked cheap. Where does he get all the money from? I can't imagine the shop sells well. Ichigo asked curiously. Yoruichi let out an unladylike snort. No, the shop's a dead-end setup meant to trick poor unsuspecting Shinigami into smuggling things in and out of Soul Society for Kisuke, with them being none the wiser. But yeah, Kisuke has plenty of money on the side. He made a fortune in the human world over the last century by dropping a design here or a blueprint there in some engineer's pocket. Believe it or not, he owns a small stake in several semiconductor companies. Ichigo blinked in surprise. Had N. Clogs was a human investor. He suddenly had a random image of the eccentric Shinigami standing in three-piece pinstripe suit, sporting huge wads of cash in both hands, and laughing wildly. Yeah, I can believe that. She led him to the end of the hallway and slid the door open, revealing an immaculate and very modern dining table and set, all red, while the hardwood floors were a polished dark brown. His father and Urahara were sitting next to each other on one side and were having a light conversation which promptly ended when he and Yoruichi entered. "Where's the food?" she asked bluntly. Urahara smiled. "Tessai-san is bringing it from the kitchen." Yoruichi gave an appreciative nod and led him to the table. Ichigo broke away from her arm and pulled out the chair, motioning for her to sit down with his eyes. She looked at him momentarily, a flash of surprise crossing her face, before her eyes narrowed in a cat-like manner and her lips curved in a small smile. Yoruichi ran a finger down his jaw as she went to sit down and Ichigo pushed the chair in from behind her. My, she purred. "Not just a knockout, but a gentleman too. That girlfriend of yours sure has trained you well." Ichigo rolled his eyes as he took his seat next to her. "Trust me, she's the last person to learn manners from. She's as wild as can be." "Oh?" A fine brow raised questioningly as she leaned towards him. "How wild are we talking here? Does she get our little Ichigo all hot and bothered?" Ichigo let out a chuckle as he put his weight on the chair arm, closing the distance between the two of them. "Oh yeah, she's a total fire-breathing dragon." "Okay. Red card. Red card." His father exclaimed while making an X with arms. "I didn't come halfway across town to see my son flirt with some middle-aged cougar." And as soon as he made that comment, Isin was forced to snap his neck sideways as a chopstick sailed through the air where his forehead had been half a second before and deftly nailed itself into the wall behind. "I'm nowhere near that old, you jackass. How could you call a bombshell like me middle-aged?" "Yoruichi-san." Urahara said in distress. "Please don't put holes in the wall. They're very difficult to fix." "My point stands," his father said gruffly. Ichigo silently laughed to himself as the dark-haired woman next to him fumed in anger. That was, until she turned to him. "Boy, Ichigo, let's get hitched." There was a brief moment of silence among the four of them before Ichigo managed to compose himself and ask, what?" "You heard me," she said, crossing her arms with a stern look. "Put a ring on my finger." He opened his mouth, closed it and then opened it again. "Oh my, Yoruichi-san. How forward of you." Urahara exclaimed delightfully. "What do you mean you want to get hitched with my son? He has a girlfriend, you home-wrecking witch." His father exclaimed incredulously. "Stay out of this, Isin, this doesn't involve you," she said offhandedly. "I think it involves me a great deal." His father retorted. For his part, Ichigo turned towards the door in the back of the dining room which he remembered led to the kitchen from his earlier tour of the place. "How far does Tessai-san have to go for this pizza?" he asked rhetorically. "Russia." "Boy, don't ignore me," she said while lightly nudging him in the side with her elbow. "Quick, get on one knee and make with the proposal already." He looked at her for a full 3 seconds and legitimately considered going through with it. Just to see the dumbfounded looks on their faces. But if Tiamat or Yusaka ever found out. Ichigo closed his eyes in with a sigh. "Remind me, why am I proposing to you?" Just to piss Isin off. She threw his father a smug look before turning back to him and said seriously, "You'll have to take my family name and be entered into the Shimin family register. Those stuffy elders would never allow it otherwise." "We've had this conversation before," Isin said dryly. "I'm not handing Ichigo over to those sharks." Ichigo gave his father a strange look of bewilderment. "They've had this conversation before. When was him marrying Yoruichi ever a conversation?" "Oh but Isin, look." And Yoruichi pulled his arm so that they were shoulder to shoulder and practically touching cheeks. "Don't you think Ichigo and I would make a cute couple? How about it, Ichigo? Want me to give birth to your kids?" Before he could answer, his father did. I think you would be a considerable downgrade from the girl he brought home. Urahara's hand snapped out at preternatural speeds and snagged all the utensils on the table before his father had even finished speaking, and Yoruichi sent both of them a disgruntled glare as she dislodged herself from Ichigo's side. Again, Ichigo sighed. This was now 2 days in a row a woman had offered to let him father her children. And, as it were, both of them could transform themselves into black cats. Perhaps it was a sign of future things to come. And on that thought, a heavy frown marred his face. His girls really were going to kill him at this rate. At the very least, Yoruichi was joking. He hoped. The back door slid open and Tessai walked out, carrying 2 large metallic trays, each with a steaming goodness of cheese, tomato sauce and baked dough. As the tall man put them down on the table, Ichigo confirmed the earlier declaration from Urahara, 1 pizza of black olives and another of spicy chicken. You sure took your time, Tessai-san, Urahara said with a chuckle. I thought I ordered the pizza, not that you had to bake them yourself. Tessai pushed up his sunglasses further along the bridge of his nose as he took the chair at the head of his table. The oven wasn't working, so I had to manually heat them with kidm. What? Urahara's eyes went wide. Impossible. I designed it myself. There shouldn't be any issues with it all. I can assure you, there was. Light reflected off Tessai's sunglasses. I had to erect a barrier around the oven after it coughed on fire. I feared another explosion in the kitchen. Thanks for the food, Yoruichi said as she took a slice of spicy chicken and put it on her plate. When are you going to grow up, Kisuke? Not everything is a toy for you to play with. It wasn't a toy, Yoruichi-san, Urahara pouted. I built it for half the cost with twice the efficiency. And a tenth of the shelf life, she muttered. Everyone grabbed a slice and muttered a quiet prayer of thanks, Ichigo having had to suppress a small wince as a sharp pain swept through the back of skull as he emulated them. Devils and prayers did not mix well, regardless of how mundane said prayers were. So, Isen-san. How's Riken-san doing these days? I haven't heard from him in a while. Urahara said animatedly as he took a bite of his slice. His father gave Urahara a flat stare. Kisuke, when the fuck did you ever hear from Riken? Just trying to make conversation, sheesh. His father rolled his eyes. I don't know what new game you're playing, but I want no part of it. Ichigo and I are out of here as soon as possible. Urahara simply gave a low laugh and Ichigo noted those calculative eyes turn on him. Then Kurosaki-kun, and Urahara's tone sharpened just enough to make Ichigo sit a bit straighter, but a layer of amusement still hid itself in his voice. How has college been for you? If I recall correctly, you were studying pre-med, yes? Following in your father's footsteps? I was, yeah. Ichigo nodded. But after my freshman year I decided to switch to business. I'm close to graduating and I'm thinking of going for a master's degree in economics or doing an international MBA. Not fully decided. His father looked at him in surprise. You didn't mention you dropped out of medicine. I didn't drop out, he responded curtly. I switched majors. Which is pretty common for freshmen. An indescribable look passed through his father's eyes and Ichigo briefly wondered if it was hurt, but he quickly dismissed the notion. His father had never verbally expressed any expectations of his career, so he doubted that him no longer pursuing a medical career would bother the man at all. Yoruichi and Urahara shared a look that didn't go unnoticed by him, but he purposefully kept from commenting on it. Some conversations were not worth having. How wonderful for you, Kurosaki-kun. Urahara continued. I'm happy you're making such headway in pursuing your future. SI nodded in approval. Business is a fine venture for young people. Feel free to use our shop as a reference if you ever need to. I'll give you Urahara-san's business card later for your records. Thanks, I'll keep that in mind. Ichigo doubted he would ever need to use a reference for anything. Being a crown prince of hell came with significant perks after all. Employment was not an issue. And Lucifer helped him if he was ever reduced to a state where he'd need Had and Clog's help to get a paying job. So, Yoruichi said from beside him, her eyes never leaving her plate as she put her half-eaten slice down. What made you decide to switch majors? Ichigo stared at her from the corner of his eyes before letting out a shrug. I got a job offer from someone on campus. From a business owner who needed a hand. Fetching this, fetching that. Cleaning up a mess here and there. Sometimes babysitting his son. Mild stuff. He was impressed with me and gave me a promotion, even though I didn't ask for it, nor wanted one, really. But he's a stubborn ass and is used to things happening his way. Anyways, I found myself appreciating the new vantage point, I suppose, is the best way to put it, and wanted to expand my horizons in that particular field. Thus, business. Urahara clapped twice. How wonderful for you. Isen-san, your son sure is making headways, isn't he? His father had a speculative look but nodded earnestly. Yeah, it is impressive. I'm proud of you, son. Ichigo felt a brief pang in his chest and his fingers twitched as he held his slice of pizza. He blinked twice and looked at his father with something akin to small surprise. Thanks. Ichigo had never managed to achieve the level of intimacy with his father that he had had with his mother. Whether that was a consequence of her death and absence or simply due to their very different personalities he never knew. Still, he supposed every son out there felt some semblance of something when their father expressed pride in them. From the back of his mind, he felt Tiamat stir and slight coolness spread through his chest, alien and opposite to the fire that thrummed within him. And it was in that Ichigo realized just how much his father's words had touched him. Because if the emotion hadn't been so strong, then Tiamat would not have felt what he did not wish to willingly share. "Yeah, thanks," he repeated. His eyes flickering from his plate to the half-empty trays of pizza to walls, Ichigo gathered his thoughts and refocused himself. Urahara was giving him a piercing look, he noticed. Well then, the shadow of his hat covering his eyes, how is everyone else then, Kurosaki-kun? Ichigo shifted in his seat, confusion settling on his brow. How's who? By all your friends, of course. Inoue-san and Uruk-san both had the excellent grades to get into the University of Tokyo alongside you. And I believe Arasawa-san and Sato-san both were let in on athletic scholarships. Really, the 5 of you have made such significant strides, it's very heartwarming for this humble shop owner to see. Oh. His friends. Right. Them. Friends. In his mind flashed Graphia's silver eyes, filled with sternness and affection. Surzich's eyes of blue-green, shining with mischief and barely restrained power. Ajuka's ice blue gaze, calm and collected and brimming with hidden madness beneath it all. Sarah's eyes that shifted hues depending on her mood and dancing with delight and desire. Albium's lifeless grey gaze that could erupt into cruelty and kindness in equal measure. Yusaka and her eyes of warmth and gold that soothed the rage in his soul. Her soft touch and laughter that rang in his ears so beautifully and clean and lifted the demonic pollution from his eyes with but a smile. Tiamat. His crazy, selfish, borderline sociopathic Tiamat with her haunting blue eyes like twin oceans, threatening to drown him in a moment's notice. Ever present in his mind like an impossible chime ringing at the bottom of the sea. Yeah. Friends. Ichigo blinked and set his face neutral. Wiping his hands clean with a napkin, he laced them together as he set his elbows on the table and rested his chin on his interlocked digits. Last I heard, everyone was happy and healthy. Iruchi rustled beside him and Urahara locked gazes with him. That's good to hear. I imagine you all must get up to several adventures in your spare time. I'm sure you have quite the few tales to tell. We really don't, he said after a small pause. They're busy with their classes. I'm busy with mine, along with other things going on. There was a sharp break of silence in the dining room. Tessai looked as impassive as ever. Yuruchi also had quite the poker face of her own. His father was playing with his pizza crust on his plate rather than making any effort to eat it. And Urahara frowned at him pronouncedly. Well, he said with a slight tone of seriousness. That's not good. Friends should be spending time with each other. Especially when you're young, otherwise, in your adult years, you find yourselves caught up in the day-to-day and hardly have time for anything else. Ichigo shrugged. Maybe we're already at that point. Life happens, after all. You meet people, you meet new ones, and sometimes some things just fade away. Can't always be chasing after what you had, right? His father flinched and Ichigo's eyes lingered on his hands for a brief while. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. Suddenly he was reminded of a memory from more than a year ago. Oh? Her countenance cool as ever as he pinned her hands onto his bed angrily. So eager for more, beloved. Tiamat, his voice on the edge of a growl. I told you, I don't want to talk about it. You are far too stubborn at times, little one, she said, hints of exasperation creeping through her words. He scoffed. You always said stubbornness was one of my more attractive qualities. In matters of war, yes. Not when it comes to your own heart. His grip around her wrists grew tighter. I told you, there's nothing to talk about. Why are you so dead set on bringing up this conversation now? Do not be so daft. Her eyes narrowed. What thought in your head is hidden from me? What memory of yours have I not dreamt as I slumbered in your arms? Ichigo turned his eyes away from her piercing ocean blue gaze. But even then, their bedroom filled with a gentle sea breeze, filling the space with the scent of salt and water. Beloved, her voice soft and comforting. There is no greater peace than knowing your heart. Of acknowledging your pain. You know this truth. Just as you know that there are none who can recognize the sting of betrayal better than I. And as soon the words fell on his ears, the dark exploded within him and every shadow within the bedroom and miles around twisted to life in a fury. Demonic sulfur tainted the air as it grew heavy and coiling with his miasma and rage. He bore down on her with a viscous snarl as his eyes bled a feral crimson. I wasn't betrayed. Ichigo. It wasn't the slowness of how she said it, of how the syllables were emphasized. Nor was it the quietness or the lack of judgment in her inflection. It was more that she said his name at all, instead of her usual affectionate nicknames. Ichigo flinched with horror and let go of her arms and made to scramble away from her, but she wrapped her bare legs around his hips with a small sigh. I'm sorry." Dottie looked away from her in shame, but one hand came up and the pads of her fingers slid across his cheek, cupping it and turning his neck. Forcing him to look her in the eyes. "You're young. And I know you do not appreciate the reminder of this particular truth, but it is a truth nonetheless. You are young, and you have been through far too much for someone of your few years." Ichigo turned his head slightly and kissed her hand against him. Tiamat gave a kind smile and brought the hand to back of his neck and pulled him down. Ichigo immediately nuzzled her hair, breathing in her scent of water and salt, drowning himself in her comfort. He felt her cool touch as she threaded her fingers through his hair. "Oh beloved," her soft murmurs both affectionate and mournful as she kissed his hair again and again. "You are bound to darkness, your very soul song changed by the crimson Lucifer when he made you anew. Deeper still the first flame rages, anathema to all of creation. And around it swirls the shade of wrath incarnate. I fear for you. For your heart. Do not wallow in your angst. Acknowledge it. Confront it. Move forward. Never run from yourself, beloved. A hollow fang will never strike true. Abandon your fear. Look forward. Move forward and never stop." Ichigo shut his eyes tight as old words echoed in his mind. He wrapped his arms under her and crushed her to him, burying his face in her neck. "I love you." Ichigo stared down at his hand solemnly. That was the first time he had told Tiamat he loved her. And it was the only time he ever openly acknowledged how the treatment from his old friends had cut him so deep. He had come to terms with it, at least he had convinced himself that he had. He had told himself he had understood that they were only trying to look out for him and do their best to keep him safe and happy. They may have succeeded in the first half, but utterly failed to achieve the second half. He didn't need to be treated differently. He didn't need to be looked on with pity or have his friends walk around him as if on eggshells. He just wanted them to be them. Oh well. What's done is done. As the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. In this case, quite literally. He didn't blame them, not now after all these years, and so many things had changed for him personally. Not when he had Yusaka and Tiamat and all the insanity of the underworld. Not when he could draw forth Zangetsu and fight for a future he wanted to build for himself. He had made his choice. He made it when he accepted Surzich's evil peace. And he had reaffirmed it standing in front of his mother's grave. Move forward and never stop. He took a deep breath and leaned back into his chair, looking at the 4 Shinigami and Gigai seated around him. It is what it is. Stuff happens. So, how have you 4 been? 4 former captains all sitting around the human world. I'm surprised Soul Society hasn't hauled your old asses back. Or are gatherings like these common for you? Sitting around, eating pizza, having little powwows. His father mouthed powwows with an affronted face, while Yoruichi poked him hard in the ribs, more than likely not appreciating being called old. "Why yes. That's exactly what we do." Urahara laughed. "Honestly speaking, for Yoruichi-san, Tessai-san and myself, going back to Soul Society is more of a headache than anything. We've been gone for so long that all of our spots have been filled and there's nothing left for us to reclaim." Ichigo raised a brow in question. "What about family and friends?" "I never lost contact with my family," Yoruichi said with a shrug. "The Shimin family is old. Really old. And just as powerful. When I left, they wanted answers. And boy did they get them. Not to mention I have my ways of sneaking in and out of the place." Ichigo turned towards her. "You mean they knew about Aizen?" Yoruichi nodded, but then said, "Not all of them. Just my immediate family members and some of the clan elders. Sadly, without proof, they were regulated to make moves in the shadows only. And very carefully too, so that Aizen wouldn't notice. Perceptive bastard that he was. As for me," Urahara began as he tipped his hat over his eyes. "Well, my past is something that should be best left forgotten, Kurosaki-kun. He's a Rukongai orphan that was adopted into a retainer clan of the Shimin family. Tessai is also from retainer clan, but born into one unlike this street urchin." Yoruichi said flippantly with a roll of her eyes. "Yoruichi-san." Urahara cried petulantly, looking up from under his hat. "Why do you have to go and ruin my fun?" "Because you're an idiot." She supplied half-heartedly. Ichigo sent a look towards his father, but the man pointedly ignored him. Ichigo would have sighed, but his father's habit of keeping his own past a secret was his business. In fairness, Ichigo had his own secrets, after all. Besides, he had had Yusaka do some digging for him. He knew more than his father thought he did. He returned his attention to the other Shinigami in the room. "Then the 3 of you have known each other for a long time?" Tessai nodded. "Essentially, yes. We've been together since we were children." The Shimin family saw Urahara-san's genius from a young age and did their best to nurture it. "My own family has had a long history in the Kiden Corps, so it was predetermined path for me. And as for Yoruichi-san, well," he let out a small laugh, "she was the princess of the clan." Ichigo glanced towards her and, for her part, Yoruichi merely shrugged. "It's a lot more impressive than it sounds. There's a lot of posturing and standing on ceremony. Even the fun stuff like the Secret Tactics Corps can be pretty boring at times, since we had to report directly to Central 46. Ahem, his father coughed into his hand. Kisuke, you said you had something to discuss. Ichigo frowned in annoyance. He was honestly enjoying hearing some insight on the lives of the people he had fought alongside with 6 years ago. As well as learning some of the inner workings of Soul Society. He could appreciate the organization on a more structural level now that he oversaw his own little slice of the underworld. Well, it wasn't little at all. The reality of ruling over an entire country with absolute authority weighed heavily on him. There was only so much a devil could accomplish by flaring their demonic power and expecting everyone to fall in line off for fear of their lives. Bureaucracy was its own kind of hell. Also, Yoruichi had been a princess. He subtly looked at her through the corner of her eye as she ran a hand through her long ponytail. Mentally, he overlapped Yusaka and Tiamat in his head. A princess powerful both politically and personally, and a dark-skinned beauty that had no issue walking nude around him. Did he subconsciously project his boyhood crush onto the current women in his life? His frown grew more pronounced. No, I'm being ridiculous. If anything, Tiamat and Yusaka walked into my life. Oh, yes. Urahara's voice brought him out of his musings. I asked you Hirisen-san because I wanted your help in showcasing a new kid. No. Eh? I said no, Kisuke. His father wiped his mouth with a napkin before sending Urahara a hard glare. I don't know what insane kid you've come up with this time, Kisuke, but I want no part of it. For all I know, my ass will be orbiting Jupiter if I let you carry out your crazy experiments on me. Now that's just rude. Urahara protested, much to Ichigo's amusement. Look, it's a simple thing. And Urahara patted his father once on the shoulder of his jacket and then snapped his fingers, causing the place he touched to glow a faint red. The hell is this? Isin frowned. It's a marking, kid. It remains invisible until the caster that's me uses a trigger to reveal it. In this case, the trigger would be me snapping my fingers. Okay, his father said slowly. But can you get rid of my glowing red shoulder now? Urahara blew out his paper fan and laughed loudly behind it. Oh, that's easy. The kid is specifically made to fit in the oscillations of the average human soul. Meaning, any non-human or human with above average spiritual energy can brush the mark away with a simple touch. His father grimaced and hesitantly ran a hand over the faint red light on his jacket and like a wipe on glass, the glow was swept away. Is that it? Isin frowned. Yes. That's all there is to it. No disrespect, Urahara-san, Tessai started, but such a kid seems rather useless, Yoruichi said flatly. It's dead useless. And normally I would agree with you, Urahara said with a shrewd look as he snapped his paper fan shut and then, with his other hand, snapped 2 fingers. Ichigo looked around the room, along with the other 3, but he couldn't see anything different or glowing. The dining room remained visibly unchanged. Was that supposed to have done something? Isin asked curiously. Indeed. It was. They all looked at him expectantly, and Urahara pointed the shut fan directly in Ichigo's direction. Kurosaki-kun, Urahara said with a serious tone that betrayed his usual cheerful nature. Do you recall when I greeted you and patted you on the shoulder? And your immediate reaction afterwards when you brushed said shoulder? Ichigo's jaw set tight and both his hands clenched into fists. He should have known, he should have flat out said no to the whole ordeal of coming over. But damn it, just for 1 week he'd have liked to indulge himself in nostalgia without it having him bite him in the ass. Ichigo shook his head ruefully. You son of a bitch. Isin watched with some minor fascination as his son's posture and demeanor changed. The lazy lean in his chair gone, as he instead sat with his back straight against the flat of the wood. The squaring of his shoulders as opposed to a young man's easy slouch. The tilt of chin, belaying a slight arrogance and contempt. But what startled him the most was the shift in Ichigo's eyes. Not easygoing and relaxed, but sharp, focused and a definite undercurrent of latent anger swirling within his usually soft brown eyes. Eyes that used to remind him of Masaki. Have you regained your powers, Kurosaki-kun? Kisuke asked quietly from beside him. Ichigo stared hard at the man, not frowning nor glaring, but a simple empty stare. Ichigo? He said quietly as he took in the boy's visage. His son's eyes briefly flickered toward him, his raised chin not moving, before dismissively moving back to Kisuke. The tension in the room grew thick. Yoruichi looked concerned for his son and was half turned around in her chair towards him. Tessai sat as still as stone, but Isin knew well enough the significantly larger man had his fists balled under the table. Damn it. Was this what Kisuke was after? Ambushing Ichigo and basically interrogating him? Yes, Isin had noticed a subtle change in his son. And yes, he'd be a damn fool for not noticing the uniqueness of the woman he claimed as his girlfriend. Even if he tried to hide it, it was all too readable in the way he walked. His son had a level of outward confidence and assuredness that was entirely new to Isin's eyes. Not that Ichigo hadn't been confident before. No, the boy was always one to stand headfast into whatever confrontations life had thrown at him. But it was refined now. It wasn't the brashness of youth, but a quiet self-assuredness he was more accustomed to seeing in the upper echelons of Soul Society's nobility, as well as the Gate 13's lieutenants and captains. It was the mark of someone who knew they were powerful and was comfortable with wearing it. That wasn't something a human teenager could pull off. And then, of course, there had been his girlfriend, Tiamat. Arrogance. Sheer and utter arrogance, of something greater looking down on something of no note. Oh, he had seen that visage 1,000 times over amongst the great noble clans of Soul Society. And after Kain's death and the Shiba clan's fall from grace, it was all he ever saw. But there was no maliciousness in those ferocious blue eyes. No sense of contempt or disdain. Just a silent disinterest, like the way one would look at a microscope slide. Clinical and aloof. But no matter the oddness, no matter the changes in his son he had seen, he had said nothing. Because Ichigo looked happy. And ultimately, that was all that mattered. But his powers? No, I didn't get my powers back. Ichigo said with a sigh, and as he did let out that exhale, the tension in the boy's shoulder slipped away and he was sitting casual and at ease again. I find that difficult to believe, Kurosaki-kun. And as Isen turned to look at the former captain of the 12th Division, he noted the man had no trace of humor in his voice. Isuke, he said with strong warning in his voice, that's enough. Did you know, Kurosaki-kun, Urahara went on, ignoring him altogether, that almost 3 years ago now, all trace of you disappeared from the human world. There was an emergency meeting held, half of Soul Society was ready to march out and look for you. They had even contacted me, asking for my help to track you down. But then, before the Gate 13 or Central 46 could issue any further orders, a royal decree came down from the Soul King's palace. Isen's eyes flew wide. What? You never told me that. Urahara nodded but kept his gaze firmly on Ichigo, who had crossed his arms and set his face neutral. I didn't, but it's true nevertheless. The Soul King himself forbade Soul Society from taking any measures to locate you and decreed that none are to approach you. And yet, you do not look surprised to hear any of this, Kurosaki-kun. Isen turned to look at his son, who sat still as stone. The Soul King had become involved in whatever Ichigo was concerned with. Isen could feel his heart hammering in chest and a thin layer of sweat begin to form under his clothes. What the hell was going on? It's been centuries since the Soul King has spoken, Urahara continued. Perhaps even longer. Soul Society is removed from its sovereign's rule, but for a direct decree to come down all of Sirte has been shaken. Soul Society's future generations will remember it as a major historical event on par with Aizen's own betrayal. And at the heart of both is you, Kurosaki-kun. Urahara leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. You came into the contact with the greater supernatural world, didn't you? Isuke. And it wasn't just him who yelled out. Yoruichi had slammed her hands down on the table and stood straight up. His own chair made a high-pitched wail against the wooden floor as he jerked around toward Urahara. And Tessai was heavily frowning in disapproval at the end of the table. Have you gone insane? You know that's for, basically, yeah. Didn't? Isen's words died in his throat as he slowly turned toward his son in bafflement. Ichigo. His son shrugged and Urahara's eyes widened. So, it is true. Ichigo sighed and Isen just stared at him as if he were some sort of alien. Yeah, I left the Japanese cycle of souls. Gotta hand it to you, head and clogs, I always suspected you knew more than you let on, but damn, you really do keep tabs on everything, don't you? Isen leaned back into his chair and let out a leaden breath. You got your powers back elsewhere? His son shook his head. No, I was being honest, I didn't get my Shinigami powers back. I got new ones instead. New ones? What new ones? Isen frowned. Wait, did the boy awaken his mother's bloodline? Did he? Isuke was practically vibrating in his seat and leaned so far forward the man's stomach was touching the table. His eyes fully open, gleaming with curiosity and yearning. No, neither Soul Society nor I could detect you anywhere on Earth. You left the world, where did you go? No. Who did you meet? Ichigo looked at the man appraisingly and then set his eyes on each of their faces, studying them closely. And finally, Ichigo's eyes fell on him and Isen could feel a certain weight there. His son kept his gaze locked tight on him before letting out another sigh. Lucifer. I met Lucifer. Isen's blood ran cold. The devil. The Christian devil. Yoruichi looked at Ichigo with alarm and let out a harsh whisper. You sold your soul to the devil. Ichigo gave a half shrug and said nonchalantly, was a good deal at the time. Still is, in retrospect. Isen stared at his son for all of 1 second before shooting out his chair with so much force it tumbled over and fell to the ground sideways. Are you insane? He yelled at his son. You sold your soul to the devil. Dad, Ichigo said calmly, relax, it's not of a big of deal as you think. Not as big of a, he began incredulously before yelling back. Are you out of your mind? You just admitted to selling your soul to the devil. You gave up your humanity. For what? For your powers. How could you betray everything you've stood for? Fuck you. Ichigo roared as he also shot up and slammed the table so hard with his fist that it cracked, and at the same time a blast of hot air slammed into Isen's face. "Kurosaki-kun," Urahara said with a slight warning. "Ichigo." Yoruichi put a hand softly on his elbow. "Betray? What the fuck did I betray?" Ichigo slammed his fist down to the table again, causing all the plates to jump and the table to crack further. "Huh, Dad. What the fuck did I betray?" Isen could only watch in abject dread as his son's eyes briefly blinked between his normal brown to a furious red. "Did I fucking betray Seoul Society? The fucking place I've only ever been to once, and it wasn't exactly under the most welcoming circumstances if anyone fucking cares to remember. Did I betray being a fucking Shinigami? I wasn't even one for a full Lucifer fucking year. Or was it you, Dad? Did I fucking betray you when you and all the asswhips who call themselves my friends decided to ignore my ass because I'm suddenly too fragile and too insecure to hang around with? What the fuck did I betray?" And as Ichigo's voice warped nearly inhuman at the end, Isen took a step back as the sheer fury from his son manifested as a savage red aura around his neck and shoulders. Urahara and Tessai immediately stood up tensely and Urahara raised a hand warningly. Now, Kurosaki-kun, how about we all calm down a bit?" Without even looking at him, Ichigo flipped off Kisuke and said, "Eat a dick, head and clogs. Seriously though, Dad. Your retarded goat ass honestly thinks I sold my soul for power. For fucking power. Do you not even remember it was your dumb ass that helped me learn the final Jutsuga Tenshin? You know what that entails. You know what it means to learn the damn technique. I made a choice. I gave up my powers to save all your fucking ungrateful asses. No one forced me. I didn't stand around and cry about it." Isen stared at his raging son and swallowed hard. Yes, he knew damn well what the technique did. But still. "Then why did you?" "Because I was dying," Ichigo said in exasperation, throwing up his arms into the air. There was a collective hiss in the room, and the dark presence around Ichigo receded significantly, and the air in the room no longer felt as oppressive and stifling. "Dying?" Urahara said with a confused frown. "That's what I fucking said," Ichigo said with a growl. "And before anyone starts with the whole you should know better dead people go to Soul Society bullshit, apparently, I was predetermined for the land down under. And no, I don't mean Australia. Hell, Urahara. You mean hell." Ichigo made a confirming wave with his hand before plopping back down into his chair and running both hands through his hair. "Obviously." Isen looked at his son forlornly. "What do you mean, Ichigo?" The boy rubbed his eyes tiredly. "Do you remember when those sinners broke out of hell and kidnapped Yuzu?" Isen felt his gut twist painfully. He remembered all too well. His powers had yet to fully return, and it was easily the darkest time of his life after Masaki's death. He was helpless to do anything as his precious daughter was dragged into the worst place in the universe. "When I was down there," Ichigo blew out a frustrated breath, "for some inexplicable reason, hell decided to empower me to help bring back the sinners and lock them away. To this day I still don't know why, but what I do know is that I could save Yuzu because of it, and I'm damn thankful. After it was all said and done, we came back to the human world and the Shinigami sealed the gates and purified the taint from the human world and from Yuzu's soul. And I'll forever be in their debt for doing that. But they didn't cleanse it from you," Yoruichi said quietly from beside him. Ichigo nodded. "That's the crux of it. So long as I had my Shinigami powers, they held in check whatever hell had left of itself inside of me. As soon as I lost them, it spread all over my soul like some sort of spiritual cancer." "Ancestors," Isen breathed in alarm as the full horror of what Ichigo was saying dawned on him. He didn't know. No, how could he have known? He pushed Ichigo away and left the boy to his own devices, assured that he would grow safe and secure away from their world. Had he kept Ichigo by his side, had he paid attention to his son, he would have noticed right away. He could have purified him of the taint from the early onset had he just bothered to look. Stupid. His throat constricted painfully as the guilt ran rampart through him. Isen felt like the most worthless father to have ever existed. Did he even have the right to consider himself Ichigo's father after such a colossal blunder? "And that's when you met the devil?" Urahara asked. Isen blinked away the stinging in his eyes, doing his best to ignore the surge of emotional pain in his chest and pay attention to the conversation. "Pretty much," Ichigo said readily. "The new Lucifer, by the way. The original one that the world is familiar with died a long time ago. The new one, Surzich's, well in some ways he's better than the original, in some ways he's worse. That much, I'm aware of." Urahara nodded. "The three great powers, I believe they're called." Ichigo nodded in return. "Yeah. By the time Surzich's had come to me, hell was well into my soul. I had maybe a year left. Maybe a bit more under the best medical care. So, when he offered me a new life as a devil, I took it. Damned I did, damned if I didn't." A still silence settled the room, the four Shinigami still standing while Ichigo sat in his chair. Isen, for his part, shifted his weight foot to foot as he dug his nails into his palms painfully and grit his teeth. He had failed. He had failed as a father so utterly. For what it's worth, Kurosaki-kun, Urahara said softly. I am sorry. Don't be, Ichigo said plainly. I'm happy the way things turned out. I got to live, broaden my horizons, see the world, multiple worlds really. Best part of it all is I fell in love. The full minute of silence passed as they all stared at the ground in contemplation of what Ichigo had revealed. By the way, do you mind? Isin looked up from where he had been staring at the floor to see Ichigo reach into his jacket and pull out a carton of cigarettes. Urahara shook his head. By all means. Our gigai are cancer-free. Good to know, Ichigo nodded. I can see why people get addicted to these, even if they're death on sticks for humans. Isin watched as his son put one in his mouth and put his thumb to the other end, a bright orange flame jumping from the tip of his nail to light the cigarette. As he took a puff, Ichigo then waved a hand and the cracked table instantly repaired itself and looked as good as new. Isin's brows jumped to his hairlines at the side and Urahara immediately leaned over to where the cracks had been and began tracing them with his fingers. Amazing. A temporal reversal. Matter reconstruction. Creation from nothingness. Kurosaki-san. How did you do that? Magic, his son said as he wiggled the fingers of one hand childishly. Yuichi snorted into one hand to hide her laughter and Urahara pouted at his son. I am very jealous, Kurosaki-kun. Ichigo let out a hum. Well, don't stand on my account. And sorry about the outburst earlier. But if you guys don't mind, I think I'd like to get a few answers of my own now. The four Shinigami looked at each other before deftly nodding and sitting down. What do you want to know? Urahara said. Chapter 25. History lessons. Ichigo leaned back in his chair and blew out a stream of heavy smoke towards the ceiling, gathering his thoughts, even as his father, Urahara, Yuichi and Tessai, all kept their eyes dead on him. If he was being honest, he was a tad bit embarrassed. His outburst from earlier did not sit too well with him. Not in the fact that he had had an outburst, he was wrath incarnate after all. And, as far as he was concerned, it was a long thing coming. No, it had more to do with how childish the tirade had been in its entirety. Ichigo was seriously disappointed in himself in how he had essentially regressed to being an angsty teenager and merely resorted to dropping a fuck every other word when he was yelling at his father. Being angry was one thing, a loss of articulation was another. He ran a frustrated hand through his hair while holding the cigarette with his lips. How uncool. Since when did you start smoking? He craned his neck towards Yuichi, noting her expression twinged with amusement. He briefly threw his father a look before answering her. It's a very recent thing, he said, continuing to play with his hair with one hand while taking out the cigarette with the other. If it bothers you, I can put it out. She shook her head. Just don't be puffing in my face. He let loose a small wisp of smoke towards her in response. Brat, she said with a roll of her eyes and a playful shove of his shoulder. He countered with a roguish grin and Yuichi just amusedly shook her head, her ponytail swaying with the ripples. His eyes briefly followed her hair and the violet hues that danced as the light hit her. So, Ichigo said, facing the others once more even as he still leaned back lazily in his chair. What the fuck was up with the whole treat Ichigo like he's made of glass deal after I lost my powers? There was a collective shuffling from around the table and everyone's heavy gazes fell to his father. Ichigo took a hard look at his father. The older Kurosaki's face was tight, with lines drawn across his mouth and eyes red from held-back tears. On one hand, his demonic soul greedily clawed away at the sheer misery and pain his father was projecting. On the other, he despised having to see his father like this, no matter the circumstances that led up to them. Isin ran both his hands over his face tiredly and let out a deep sigh, betraying more emotions than Ichigo could surmise in the moment. Even as he did so, Tessai got up quietly from the table and walked back through to the kitchen area. I suppose we might as well start at the beginning, Isin said quietly, as he lifted his somber gaze up from the table to meet Ichigo's eyes. I was born Shiba Isin of the Shiba clan, one of the 5 great noble families of Sirte. Ichigo stayed silent but listened attentively. I was born into the main branch of the noble clan, but as I was the younger son, I was expected to start my own branch of the family. My older brother inherited the position as the head and his eldest son in turn. Yuichi told me you've met Ganju and Kaku when you went to Soul Society. 2 faces he hadn't thought of in years flashed into his mind. Yeah. Isin nodded sadly as he crossed his arms. They're your fist cousins. They had an older brother, Kane. He was the lieutenant of the 13th Division under Yukitake. He was a good kid. Devoted, fierce, but had a reckless streak in him too. You remind me a lot of him, honestly. In another time, in another place, you would have grown up calling him brother. Both he and his wife were killed because of the same hollow. His father's mouth twisted grimly. I read Yukitake's report on the incident of Kane's death. It wasn't pretty. Poor kid deserved better. They both did. Tessai returned from the back and Ichigo's eyes briefly flickered towards the man as he placed several ceramic cups down on the table and poured in each of them a generous amount of sake. His father took the glass, raised it in thanks towards Tessai, and downed it in one go like a shot before setting it down hard. Iruchi also grabbed a cup, but Ichigo noticed that Urahara had not moved an inch, the man's face shadowed by his hat as he set his paper fan resting on his chin. When Tessai offered him a cup, Ichigo grabbed it out of politeness, but merely pressed the cup to his lips without taking a sip and set a full cup back down. He wasn't in the mood for a drink, and the flavor smoke in his mouth was currently preferable over the fruitiness of sake. Urahara suddenly spoke up from his seat. My sources in Soul Society managed to get me a copy of the report as well. Based on the uniqueness of the hollow, I'm certain it was one of many experiments engineered by Aizen. Ichigo looked at the Shinigami in surprise for a brief moment. He had honestly forgotten, Aizen's machinations had run for well over a century. One more tragedy that madman is responsible for, Yuruchi said softly from beside him. His father let out a deep hum as he poured himself more alcohol and stared at the cup as he whirled the quid around. At the time, I had risen to the position of captain of the 10th Division. Kain's death was a huge blow to the family. My father, my brother and my nephew all dead within the span 200 years. The main branch of the Shiba never truly recovered. After a moment's silence, he looked up from his drink. You really do look a great deal like Kain. Anyone who's seen both of you can immediately see the family resemblance. A clever girl like Kaku, I'm sure it took all of 5 minutes for her to put 2 and 2 together to figure out whose son you were. Ganju was always a bit slower. Though I'm sure Kaku filled him in eventually. As his father gave a rueful smile, Ichigo took out another drag of his cigarette. The 10th Division, huh? His father nodded in acknowledgement, his smile becoming a bit more nostalgic. You've met the current captain, Hesugaya-kun, yeah? At Ichigo's nod, he continued. Yeah, the kid was my 3rd seat officer. Damn powerful for a brat his age. Wasn't surprised one bit when I heard they made him captain. Kid's got the strength and the work ethic for the job. Heart of gold too. And then there was my lieutenant. Matsumoto, heh. As his father have a short laugh, a tinge of annoyance crept onto the forefront of Ichigo's mind. His last meeting with the overly talkative Shinigami had been unexpected and vexing. Yusaka was none to him happy that their date had been so thoroughly ruined. His father shook his head with an expression of fondness. Damn, did that woman frustrate me to no end. Always complaining, never doing her work on time and just constantly lazing around the barracks. But a damn good soldier to have your back in any fight. Loyal to a fault she is. Sounds like you two were good friends, Ichigo noted with surprise. Yeah, his father said. We saw each other outside of work frequently. Always fun to hang around with, that Matsumoto. Briefly wondering whether they were more than just friends, Ichigo quickly banished the thought and pressed his father on. So how did you end up living in the human world then? Got tired of the Shinigami lie and decided to try your hand at mortality? His father snorted. Hardly. It was about 25 years ago now when the 10th Division received reports of several Shinigami dying over the span of a single month in Naruki City. We were already investigating the deaths, but as the body count started mounting, I decided to go and investigate personally. I wasn't there long before I found the hollow attacking several members of my division. I went out to confront it immediately. And it was strong too. Damn strong. I doubt anyone save for a captain would have been able to go toe-to-toe with it. It also looked very strange. Strange how? In his personal experience, Ichigo had never encountered a hollow he would consider as normal looking. So, what was so odd about the one his father had encountered? His father, who had spent centuries as a Shinigami and would have encountered hundreds, if not thousands of hollows over the course of his career. Much smaller than most hollows, almost human in shape, his father said with a frown. Entirely black save for its mask. The usual bone-white color, though shaped like a human skull, almost. I had thought it a vast lord initially, but after the first few blows with the thing, it didn't fight like I've any Minos I had encountered before. What do you mean? Ichigo said with a curious look. Isin threaded both his fingers together and rested his chin on his hands. Its attacks were measured, almost economical. Minos go straight for the kill. This thing was probing, responding to my attacks with counterattacks. It was learning as we fought, learning how I fought and responding in kind. It felt less and less like a wild Minos, and more like I was fighting some amateur Shinigami who could put out the Ryatsu of a captain. So, what happened? His father's brows furrowed in thought before he said, I activated my Shikai and was prepared to get serious, but in that moment, I was attacked from behind and someone cut me deep. And it wasn't another hollow. I know the feeling of a blade too damn well. And whoever it was, they had completely managed to hide themselves from my senses. You were ambushed? Ichigo asked. Given that they didn't actually kill Isin off, Yuruchi said, we think they simply wanted to weaken him to give the hollow more of a fighting chance. Or, at the very least, drag out the fight a little longer. Urahara spoke up and said, prolonging the fight would have been a valuable way to collect data on the exceptionally rare conflicts between captains and hollows with a spiritual power that can rival a captain's. Which leads us to believe Isin-sen's assailant wa Aizen Ichigo finished for him. As both his father and Urahara nodded, Yoruichi let out a sound of distaste. Ichigo let eyes drop to the floor, his last memories of the traitorous Shinigami screaming manically at Urahara as he was slowly sealed away playing through his mind. Even now, after all these years, he still didn't know what Aizen was trying to accomplish. What he was fighting for all alone. So then? He asked quietly. Then I kept fighting. Isin said. And between my limiter and half my back bleeding profusely, the damn thing was kicking my ass pretty badly. I was about to get hit with a point-blank zero when out of nowhere the spiritual arrow knocks the stupid hollow away from me. The spirit arrow? A Quincy? Was it Ishida's dad? Nope, his father said with wide fond grin. It was your mother. Ichigo blinked once at his father before looking down at the cigarette in his hand. Mom was a Quincy. It wasn't a question. But rather a simple statement made quietly, almost an affirmation. Yes, she was, his father said, his smile growing quieter and more somber. Somehow you don't sound surprised. I've had my suspicions for a while now, Ichigo said softly. Part of me becoming a devil meant losing parts of myself. Parts I didn't even know I had. Or, at the very least, didn't know what they actually were. But that's a different discussion. What then? His father regarded for a second before he sighed. Misaki baited the hollow by allowing it to bite her, then she proceeded to blow its spiritual brains out with some Quincy technique. It was one of the coldest things I've ever seen. Naturally, anything made by Aizen wouldn't be so easy to get rid of so easily, so whatever was left of the damn hollow started swelling up and made ready to blow Misaki to smithereens. One shunpo later I'm shielding her with my body as that thing blows itself to kingdom come. I'ma tell you right now, that explosion hurt like a right bitch. But Misaki was unhurt and my bleeding ass was left face hugging the concrete, so all in all, it was an acceptable outcome. We introduced ourselves and then went on our merry way. Urahara let out a small laugh from beside his father and Yoruichi just shook her head with a small smile. And I suppose it love at first sight then, Isin-san. The eccentric shopkeeper teased good-naturedly. You know damn well it wasn't, Kisuke, his father said, throwing an annoyed glance to his side before turning back to him. Your mother was still in high school then. And, well she gave a great first impression, I was not, nor have I ever been, into jailbait. So, what? You went back to Soul Society? How did you end up meeting Mom again? After recovering from my injuries, Isin said, I went back to Naruki City for a quick follow-up. I wanted to do some private investigating on just who had attacked me while fighting that hollow. Well there, I encountered a young man carrying a woman of similar age in his arms and they were both being attacked by a different hollow. I helped them out and that young man ended up being Riken. Ichigo looked surprised. Ishida's dad. One and the same, his father nodded. He was holding on to Misaki, desperately looking for a way to save her. Ichigo used a twist of magic to dissipate what was left of his cigarette and then sat straighter in his chair, giving his father a hard stare. What happened to her? Isin frowned as he leaned forward. She had what was the beginnings of a hollow hole forming right at the top of her sternum. When Misaki allowed that hollow to bite her as bait, she somehow got infected by thing. Vilification, Ichigo said sharply. Indeed, Kurosaki-kun. I am glad to see you are still so quick to take notice. Urahara said happily, though Ichigo ignored him. So, then what? His father jabbed a thumb in Urahara's direction. This jack-off happened. Hey. Misaki was slowly dying as the hollow infection was eating away at her soul, and Riken started blaming me for Misaki's predicament, which in fairness, was entirely my fault. It was my responsibility to take care of the thing. Misaki should have had to step in that fight. But what was done was done. I'm assuming you cured Mom then of her hollow infection? Ichigo asked as he turned towards Urahara. I'm afraid not, the older Shinigami said. Tell me Kurosaki-kun, do you know what the details of holification entail? Can't say I've given it much thought before. Ichigo said with a contemplative look. Urahara let out a hum. You see, holification is a process where a hollow soul is injected into a normal soul and then the barriers between the two are completely broken down. Initially, the idea was for the hollow soul to dissipate into the normal one, strengthening the other soul significantly. It was originally intended as a way to make Shinigami stronger. Systemic spiritual absorption, Ichigo muttered to himself. Urahara blinked in surprise. Indeed. At least in theory. However, we did not possess the means nor the resources to fully control the breakdown of one soul into another, often resulting in the hollow soul acting more akin to a cancer or an infection, rather than some form-boosting supplement. Ichigo frowned heavily. The reason they failed was because it was impossible for two souls to become one. Souls were immutable. That is a simple fact of reality that cannot be changed. Not unless someone rewrote all of reality. From his time in hell, as well as having access to the devil's thousands upon thousands of years of research into magic, particularly necromancy, he knew that no matter what happened, the fusion of souls an impossible outcome. Instead, if one were to try to do such a thing, the souls would be pressed so close together on a metaphysical plane that they would spontaneously create an outer shell to contain themselves and whatever mystical forces attempting to bind them, forming an oversoul. And if one of those souls was stronger than the other, then it would become the dominating soul of the oversoul. Add into that equation Izanami's curse and the natural degradation via her primordial corruption, Japanese souls are uniquely vulnerable to the process of an oversoul. But there was one factor that Ichigo could not account for in his mother's case. Did her being a Quincy have any adverse effects on the process? Oh ho. Very good, Kurosaki-kun. A most excellent observation. College has done wonders for you. Urahara exclaimed. Ichigo rolled his eyes, just answer the question. Urahara nodded. A human soul's opposite is a hollow soul. And Quincy soul's opposite is a Shinigami soul. And yet, the mirror of a Shinigami is a hollow, as they both belong to the realm of the dead, and the mirror of Quincy is a human, as they both belong to the living. Interestingly enough, the Quincy and hollows are anathema to one another. Which is why the Quincy's power utterly banish a hollow from the cycle of souls, and a hollow's power act like a strong poison to the Quincy. As such, in Misaki-sen's case, she was Quincy's soul exposed to a hollow soul and was dying rather quickly, with the threat of utterly being consumed by the hollow's taint. So, she needed the strong spiritual bond of a human soul and a Shinigami soul to balance outer holification and keep it in check. How did you do that? Ichigo asked. Ah. Well, I'm glad you asked. First let me explain to you the concept of a soul suicide. For you see, his father promptly interrupted Urahara. He made a special gigai that basically made me a human Shinigami hybrid. But my Shinigami powers would be utterly used to suppress Misaki's holification, and, so long as the link existed, I would lose all access to my powers. This insane. Urahara protested. I was getting around to that. You still take too much time to talk, Kisuke. His father said. No one loves the sound of their voice more than Kisuke does. Yurichi added dryly. Now that's just plain rude. Tesai nodded from his spot at the table, and Urahara looked at the larger man with something akin to betrayal on his face. You too, Tesai-san. Ichigo ignored it all and kept pressing the matter forward. So, you stayed in the living world to keep mom from turning into a hollow. Yep. Kisuke helped me adjust to the world of humans and their society, and since I did learn a good deal of medicine back in my training days at the Academy and Soul Society, it wasn't long before I ended up opening the clinic. His father had a fond look on his face, no doubt lost in memories. Did you regret it? Ichigo asked as he crossed his arms. I'd be lying if I said I didn't, his father responded by crossing his own arms and mirroring his own pose. It's not easy leaving behind everything you've known and loved for a new life amongst strangers. But if I hadn't, I would never have forgiven myself. I can't walk away knowing someone is hurting because of my own failings. Better to die than having to live with that kind of shame. Ichigo's lips briefly quirked. Well, that was something he could agree with. Not too long after, Misaki graduated high school and she then moved out of the Ishida family's place and started living in a college dorm. More than often, she would drop by the clinic and just hang around, introducing me to a bunch movies and TV shows. I believe it was that summer Return of the Jedi came out. She dragged my ass to the theater after making me watch the first two movies the night before. Wait, Ichigo said with some minor confusion. Why was mom living with the Ishida's dad? His father scratched his chin. Misaki was the last of her Quincy clan, so the Ishidas were looking after her. Thing with the Quincy is, a lot of them trace their heritage back centuries. They're not so different from the Serite nobles when it comes to taking pride in their ancient heritage. The Kurosaki and Ishida family are what would be considered pure-blood Quincy, and they don't take too kindly to any sort of impurities being introduced into the bloodlines. Misaki's hollow taint was a known factor, so she became rather unwelcome among the Quincy. They treated her like she didn't even exist. All except Riken. Man may act as cold and distant as hell, but he's fiercely devoted to family. Ichigo fought the urge pinch the bridge of his nose in frustration. Same genealogical obsessions as the devils then. One thing led to another over the years, his father pressed on, and then you came. And that's when things became more complicated. Ichigo looked at the man intently. What do you mean? His father gave him a grave look. That link I had with Misaki in suppressing her holification. It somehow passed to you. Misaki's hollow had transferred over while you were in the womb. We went to Kisuke about it, but even he didn't know how it happened. Ichigo's eyes widened even as the shock ran through his very bones. Zangetsu. And the sword in his soul thrummed with infernal power, as if confirming what he had just learned. In fairness, Urahara said dryly, I offered to do some experiments to find out, but I was soundly rejected. Isin rolled his eyes. Like we were going to let you experiment on our son. So that's where my hollow powers came from? I thought it was just the process of how I relearned them from head and clogs before we invaded Soul Society. Urahara chuckled. No. I will be the first to admit I'm not the kindest individual. Both Yoruichi and his father snorted. But I am not so cruel as to halofi a teenage boy unnecessarily. But you'd do it if you thought it was necessary, Yoruichi muttered exasperatedly. Suddenly Ichigo remembered pieces of his conversation with Ginjin before he had killed all the Fullbringers. We're all born of mothers who were attacked by hollows, and we all have the presence of hollows within us. Interesting, Ichigo thought to himself. Something for me to investigate in the future. Regardless, his father said. You had awakened Shinigami powers after you met Rukia-chan. But those were hers. You awakened your own after Kisuke helped you. And because you were in Soul Society and I was still here, Misaki's hollow inside of you couldn't be suppressed by the link of this special Gigai. The link was broken, the hollow got stronger, and I slowly started to get my powers back consequently. Ichigo said simply. To think so many things were interconnected. All of this, from the continued machinations of Aizen from well over 100 years ago. Suddenly Ichigo wondered what would have happened had Surziches recruited Aizen instead of him. He shook that thought from his head. Surziches did not appreciate ambitions larger than his own, and he doubted Aizen would ever agree to willingly serve under another. Still, it was a frightening thought. So long as you were strong enough, his father said, breaking him out of his thoughts, you could keep the hollow in you suppressed. But then you used a final Jutsuga Tenshin and lost all your Shinigami powers as a result. I had hoped you would lose all traces of your hollow as well, but afterwards I could sense the barest of its Ryuko slumbering within your soul. The connection between my Shinigami powers and the hollow was gone. And your own Shinigami heritage had just been obliterated. And if that hollow ever woke up from its slumber, there would be nothing stopping it from taking over my soul. Ichigo finished for him. If you're weaker than me, then I'll destroy you and take your crown for myself. He could still remember those words from years ago, along with the maniacal laughter that accompanied them. Ichigo ran a hand over his face and let out a groan. That's why you pushed me away. Because you were afraid that if I was around too many spiritual strong people I'd get eaten by my own hollow. Afraid? No, I was terrified. Isen's eyes glistened sadly. You know better than anyone just how much the final Jutsuga jars the very soul. Even months afterwards, your soul was quite unstable. And on top of that, your chain of fate had already been severed by Kisuke. Your soul was tied to your physical body very loosely. The risk was far too great. Personally, Ichigo was more than happy there was nothing remaining of Izanami's curse within his soul. But on the other hand, why didn't you just tell me? He exclaimed. Hey Ichigo, there's a chance you're going to be eaten alive, so for your own good kindly stick to texting and phone calls for a while. Wait, did you tell the others? Is that why they along with it so easily? His father dropped his eyes, and the man looked like he had aged 10 years on the spot as the lines on face grew heavier and deeper. Yes, I convinced them if they didn't, they'd be endangering your life. And the reason I never told you was because I didn't want you to live the rest of your life in fear, he said with his head down. Ichigo stared at him in disbelief. Fear? Fear, are you kidding me? Not once, not twice, but 3 effing times I had to fight that stupid asshole inside of my soul. Zangetsu thrummed a protest from within the confines of his soul, but he pointedly ignored the bloodthirsty spirit. What on earth makes you think I'd ever be scared? Of all the stupid asinine. As he felt Yoruichi's hand fall on his shoulder, Ichigo let out a long breath of anger, putting his emotions back in check and slamming down hard on his inner darkness. Deep breaths, he told himself. And as he got hold of temper and kept it from teetering over into the demonic range, he gave his father a flat look. Dad, that's some damn stupid reasoning. His father let out a humorless laugh. Misaki used to say the same thing to me whenever I tried fibbing my way out of trouble. Well, luckily, I never had to worry about my hollow taking over my soul because fucking hell itself was keeping it in check. Yay for me, I guess. There was a collective flinch in the room at the casual reminder of his gradual descent into eternal damnation. Ichigo dropped his face into both hands and hunched over as the mental exhaustion started to creep in. Several moments of silence passed and Ichigo just kept taking deep breaths and going through various mindfulness exercises he had been forced to learn when he had inherited his sin. It's fine. Everything is perfectly fine. I walked away from all the stupidity, I'm not dying, I got new powers, and now I have 2 drop-dead gorgeous women I'm sleeping with. As he slowly pulled his face away out of his hands with a sigh, Ichigo looked up only to notice that all 4 Shinigami were giving him strange looks that could only be described as something of a mix of caution, shock and utter bewilderment. And then it hit him. I just said that out loud, didn't I? What do you mean you're sleeping with 2 women? His father said with narrowed eyes. And there it is. Ichigo pinched the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes in a silent sigh. Are you cheating on that poor girl you brought home? All trace of sorrow and regret was lost from his father's voice and instead replaced with a certain level of indignation. Poor girl my ass, he said dryly before immediately countering his father's tone. Wait, hang on, time out. We're still discussing my grievances with your life choices. Not mine. The hell with that. His father said loudly. I don't care if the sky opens up and every hollow from Huko falls onto our laps. Tell me the truth. You come clean and let me know right now that my son isn't some two-timing bastard or so help me ancestors. I'll beat your ass black and blue and drag you by your shoelaces to that poor girl and make you beg her for forgiveness on your hands and knees. It's not like that. He yelled in protest. Oh my, Urahara said, fanning himself. How salaciously wicked of you, Kurosaki-kun. I told you, it's not like that. He repeated helplessly. I let out disgruntled hum. How very ungentlemanly of you, young man. Most disappointing. I-san, no. It's not. DCH. And Yoruichi turned away from with such coldness that Ichigo legitimately winced. Fuck. Oh? The cool chime of water rang clear in his head. On your hands and knees, little one. Shall I spill my woes of your unfaithfulness and mine broken heart to your father? Double fuck. Arg. Listen to me, all of you. It's not like that. Then explain, his father said with an expression that said there would be consequences if he didn't like the answer. Ichigo rubbed both sides of his temples in frustration. Look, they know about each other. And they're cool with it. We've had this three-way thing for the last couple of years and it's working out. Before his father could probe further, Yoruichi turned to him with her hands on her hips and her eyes in a half-lidded stare of utter contempt. They know about each other. He nodded. Yes. They're okay with each other. They'd honestly prefer the other dead, but Ichigo wasn't about to say that with a frosty glint in Yoruichi's eyes. Yes. And they haven't tried to kill you? Ichigo's mouth twisted wryly. Evidently. Yoruichi continued to stare at him flatly for several more seconds before suddenly breaking into a large Cheshire grin and vigorously patting him on the shoulder. Well. You really have turned into a total playboy. To think you've come such a long way from the shy little boy when you first saw me naked under the Smkyoku hill. His father choked where he sat and Urahara let out a jovial laugh. For his part Ichigo reached out and finally downed the drink Tessai had poured out at the start of the conversation. Keep teasing, he said as he threw her a sideways glance. Maybe I'll take you seriously and I'll get you naked in front of me again. There was a sudden hush in the room as Yoruichi stared at him with slightly widened eyes before throwing her back and roaring with laughter. Oh, you are so much more fun to hang around with now that you've gotten laid. Remind me to send your girlfriend a thank you note. Oh that's right, both of them. His father rubbed his brows. Can we please get back on topic? Notion seconded, Ichigo said plainly. But then his father's hands fell away and he gave Ichigo a strange look. Wait, Isin said bringing his attention back to the table and Ichigo could practically see the gears in his head turning from the way that his face scrunched in thought. That girl of yours, her name is Tiamat. Isn't there some ancient Egyptian thing with that name? Mesopotamian, Urahara corrected from the side while his eyes widened ever so slightly. Allegedly the primordial mother of the now extinct pantheon. Yoruichi's eyebrows rose into her hairline even as a certain hitch-entered voice. You're sleeping with some sort of deity. Technically a primordial, Ichigo said slowly. Which is a step or two up on the cosmic stage. Well, now she's actually a dragon, but she still holds onto part of her primordial domains. Look, it's literally an entire epic. Let's not get into it. They all stared at him, their mouths slightly agape. You said that she was from the Middle East. His father exclaimed in shock. You said she had a husband and kids and they all died in the Iraq War. Ichigo raised both hands in his defense. Never actually said that, Dad. And they did in a war in Iraq. Just not the one in the early 2000s. But rather the one that happened several thousands of years ago. And, well, no one called it Iraq back then. His father just looked at him, mouth gaping in wonder. That's rather impressive, Kurosaki-kun, Urahara said with a gleam in his eye. You've made deep headways into the wider supernatural world. Wait, his father said. Now I want to backtrack on what I said earlier. What about the other one? Who is she? Ah. Yusaka. Ichigo quickly weighed the merits of revealing his current marital status and, after a few moments of internal deliberation, decided against it. That particular conversation could happen later in the future. Preferably when Yusaka herself was there with him so he could introduce her properly to his family. Ichigo rubbed the back of his head sheepishly as his thoughts drifted to his wife. Her name is Yusaka, she's a nine-tailed fox who lives in Kyoto. She has a daughter, but she's not married or anything. So, don't try pulling any more accusations of cheating on me. 100% a lie. Yusaka was married. To him. But again, he was content keeping that bit of information to himself for now. His father raised a questioning eyebrow. Yoruichi on the other hand sent him a wicked smile. Older women who also happen to be mothers. Well, I guess we know where on the Freudian scale you fall, Oedipus. Ichigo looked at her in surprise. You know Greek mythology? Irichi rolled her eyes while Tessai let out a chuckle. Do give us some credit, Ichigo-kun. We've been in the human world for much longer than you have, after all. Sorry, he said with an apologetic smile. I sometimes forget how old you all really are. Several moments of silence passed as they all took turns pouring more drinks and sipping them down. Finally, his father called out to him and Ichigo was surprised by the expression he was making. His father looked as serious as he had ever seen him. Are you happy? The simplicity of the question yet its remarkable profoundness left Ichigo speechless. But as he looked into his father's eyes, the steeled resolve he found there gave him the self-assurance to answer readily and easily. Yeah, I am. His father held his gaze for a brief moment longer. And those girls, both of them. Are they happy as well? This time the answer came much less casually and was rooted in firm conviction. Yes. Isin finally let out a long breath that Ichigo didn't realize he had been holding in, and then his father smiled sadly at him. I'm a fool, Ichigo. Have been since the day I was born. Ever since Masaki died, I did my best to raise you three, but I know I never could succeed completely. I could never truly make the three of you entirely happy. Ichigo opened his mouth but found a lump growing in his throat. Dad, you did great. We were never. However, Isin cut him off with a wave of a hand and a pained smile. Don't even bother. The three of you kids lost your mother way too early. And there's not a damn thing in this world that can ever hope to replace a mother's love. Trust me, I remember too damn well when I lost mine. And then his father placed both palms on the table and bowed his head and the floodgates nearly broke open. For all my foolishness, for all my failures as a father, I apologize. Please forgive me. Ichigo immediately lurched out of his chair and reached across the table to set his father straight. No, Dad, stop it. Look, don't damn it, I'm not good with this crap. And as his father raised his head, with actual tears in his eyes, Ichigo had to actively call upon his demonic nature to crush the swell of emotions rising up from within his chest and threatening to overcome him. With a deep breath and cool head, Ichigo said firmly, I'm not mad. Back then, maybe. But I got over it. I moved on. I'm happy. And I'm happy for you and Yuzu and Karen and that you're all healthy and living your lives without any deep burdens. Just like I am. Let's just agree that there were fuck-ups and to move on with our lives. No point on dwelling on what was said and done. His father looked at him with such emotion that, again, Ichigo was fighting to keep his countenance his usual neutral self. The man rose and reached across the table with a hand and Ichigo grabbed it in a warm handshake. Isin smiled sincerely. Your mother would be incredibly proud of you, Ichigo. I know I am. As the two had their moment and went to sit back down, Ichigo heard slight hiccups and turned to see Tessai wiping entire streams of tears running down his cheeks. It's such a touching family moment. The large man's shoulders quivered as he dabbed a tissue behind his sunglasses. There, Tesha-san, Urahara said as he patted the man. Irichi mirrored the gesture and reached out to rub Tessai's shoulder. All this being said now, though, his father said with a deep sigh. Now you definitely have to maintain your distance from us. Ichigo brushed a few bangs out of his eyes. That I understand all too clearly. Already just me being here in the last few days has been a big risk. Devils of my rank usually don't leave the underworld. Only really leaving in the cases of fighting wars or directly meeting with representatives of other pantheons. Of course, in his case, his wife counted as such a representative. Yusaka really does enjoy it when they roleplay aggressive negotiations. Devils of your rank, Kurosaki-kun. Urahara noted sharply. Are you quite high up in their hierarchy, then? Ichigo shrugged. I'm sitting at the very top of the pyramid, yeah. Though due to seniority there are 4 others ranked above me. Fascinating, Urahara leaned forward with interest. Typically, I give little interest to the matter of devils and their kind, but even I've heard of whispers of some new horror recently ascended into their ranks. I take it that's you. How did you get to the top of their hierarchy so quickly? The others also all looked on in interest. Horror. Ichigo repeated, a tad bit insulted. I haven't done anything even remotely horrifying since actually, no, never mind. Let's not go there. As to how I got there, well, devils have their own concepts of nobility and bloodline purity from their demonic ancestors, but honestly speaking, their entire civilization revolves around the concept of might is right. I'm stronger than most of them so I get a seat at the best table. It's really just that simple. Okay, I may be oversimplifying the process, but trust me, devils are quite straightforward when it comes to how their society works. Urahara looked like a kid in a candy shop. And how many ranks are there? Are they also dependent on personal power and ability? How do the dynamics of rising power affect an ability? Ichigo immediately held up a hand. We'll be here all day if I try to explain everything. I'll just mail you the latest edition of the annotated Gosha, it'll answer all your questions. Well, most of them, anyways. Urahara sighed. I suppose that's fair. But now I am curious of another thing, Kurosaki-kun, just how powerful are you now? Even with you sitting here in front of me I can barely sense any spiritual power from you. Ichigo tapped the table. That's because I'm not human anymore. I don't produce Ryoko, at least not in the traditional sense. No, my essence puts out demonic power. Which is very difficult for humans to sense if they aren't properly trained to do so. Even more curious, Urahara said. I would like to point out that I am a Shinigami, not a human. Ichigo continued a rhythmic tap on the table. Hollows, Shinigami, Quincy. All different variants of the same soul form that stems from humanity. Devils, on the other hand, are something completely outside of that system. So then how did you become one then? Because your soul was a mixture of Quincy, Hollow and Shinigami. Ichigo nodded. Which further drives home my point of all of them being made from the same cosmic blueprint. As to how I became one, sorry, that's a trade secret. But suffice it to say, we have our ways to alter the souls of beings without damaging their very core essence. Urahara's eyes went wide and Ichigo noted with great amusement that the man seemed to be close to drooling with how his mouth parted. But back to an earlier point, Ichigo said as he shifted in his chair. I should clarify that normal humans can't feel a devil's power if it's latent or being suppressed. But when a strong enough devil exerts their power, it becomes very obvious. At particularly high densities, demonic power can physically manifest. And I'm assuming you are capable of producing such dense power. Easily, Ichigo said. But I'm not going to. There's a good reason devils at my weight class don't go into the human world. Our powers are too dangerous. Demonic power of that density will taint both the physical and spiritual planes. Think of it like magical radiation. Except instantly lethal upon exposure for weaker beings. Which brings me back to my initial question, Kurosaki-kun. Just how powerful are you? Ichigo thought about the question and how best to answer. He could explain it in the terminology of the underworld, where, at the height of his powers, he was about 6 times more powerful than a Satan-class demon. But he doubted the others would even understand how powerful a Satan was even supposed to be, let alone multitudes of that. He bobbed his head and thought before gingerly saying, difficult for me to give you a direct comparison, but if I were to be honest, if I were to unleash my full power right now, I think I could easily destroy everything within 150 kilometers or so, with my sheer presence alone. Give me a week with no interference from anyone, and I could probably flood the planet with enough infernal taint to kill all life on the surface and leave it inhospitable for a century or two. Mind you, I'd be dead exhausted after that week. Even as he finished his words, he took in all their astonished expressions with their mouths agape. Maybe he should have downplayed the full extent of his powers. You're serious, Urahara said breathlessly. Not knowing what else to say, Ichigo just said, yeah, I am. And there are others stronger than you? Much stronger. And not just amongst the devils. Other species have their own pantheons of demons and deities that can crush me easily. Urahara nodded to himself. I've always heard as much, but to have tangible proof sitting right before me. As ever, you are frightening child, Kurosaki-kun. Ichigo scowled. I'm not a child. And you entirely ignore the frightening part, the Shinigami said with a rueful headshake. Well, his father said, still looking completely shocked by everything revealed to him. I suppose you really have found your own life to live now. I have, Ichigo said solemnly. But I'll still try to keep in touch with you and the girls. Tiamat gave me an earful last night about being more considerate of my sisters. His father gave him a searching gaze. Ichigo let out a small laugh. Don't be fooled by her aloofness. She's a huge softie when it comes to kids. She doesn't like showing it or others knowing it, but given the opportunity she'll mother any child put in front of her. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask all of you a question. Fire away, his father said. Last I heard, there was a gag on the greater supernatural world for Soul Society. How do you all know about it? Is it from living in the human world? It was Yoruichi who answered. Isin and I learned of it from our families. The highest ranked elders of the 5 great families all know. And these 2 learned it from me. Kisuke would have figured it out eventually, so I filled him in before he poked the wrong bee's nest and got his head lopped off. So, it's just the great noble clans who know in Soul Society? Ichigo asked. Yoruichi shook her head. No. The Captain Commander knows. Hell, he's old enough to remember what it was like before Soul Society existed. Some of the older captains definitely know too, like Yukitake and Kamraku and Unohana. The others though definitely don't. And then there's Central 46, but even among them I would imagine only the 6 judges know for sure. If any of the 40 wise men know as well, they've probably kept it to themselves and have not said a word to any soul. Any breach of the secret will result in immediate death, along with anyone close to the person to ensure complete censure. Ichigo briefly wondered to himself if he should ask about the primordial curse, pondering whether or not that was another secret that was kept from the Shinigami. But he decided to risk it anyways. What do you guys know about the origins of hollows? His father and Yoruichi shared a look. Interesting. What do you know about the origins of hollows? His father threw back at him cautiously as he reached for the last of the sake and poured himself some more of the drink. I know about the chain of fate. And how fractured the cycle of souls is in Japan due to Izanami's curse. Yoruichi visibly flinched and his father quickly wore a grimace. Urahara chuckled at their reactions and explained to Ichigo, "You'll have to excuse them, the great noble clans were all raised on the old Shinto faith. And for the dead in particular, that name holds significant negative connotations." That made sense to Ichigo. Given the fact that the average Shinigami could live to be several centuries, if not even older, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to conclude that families like Yoruichi's or his father's, which would also make them his family, he realized, probably had ancestral souls that suffered under Izanami's tyranny. That being said, Kurosaki-kun, you seem awfully familiar with the history of Soul Society. Secrets glisten from the devil? Urahara asked with a laugh. Ichigo shook his head. No, he didn't tell me. He knows about it, it's kind of an open secret to the rest of the world, but I learned of it myself after I spoke to Amaterasu. Yoruichi's neck snapped so fast in his direction that he was afraid she might have hurt herself, and his father began choking on the spot from the sake, even as his eyes bulged out. What did you just say? She whispered in astonishment. Ichigo hesitated and leaned slightly away from the fierce look Yoruichi was giving him. The fact that the Shinto afterlife's fractured state is an open secret. Yoruichi leaned in closer with a humorless laugh and edged him on with her hands. Ha, no. The part after that. I learned all of this from Amaterasu. Yoruichi's mouth fell open slightly. Amaterasu? As in Amaterasu-sama. Amaterasu Mikami-sama. Ichigo continued to edge away from the near-maniacal look in Yoruichi's eyes. Yeah, that's the one. Head of the Shinto pantheon, divine son. Pain in my ass, he added silently to himself. You spoke with Amaterasu-sama. His father belted out. Yeah, he responded carefully. I'm assuming this is a big deal. A big deal, he says, Yoruichi said with quiet sarcasm as she leveled him with a flat look. Ichigo, his father breathed in wonder. How on earth did you even manage to talk with her? Ichigo blinked at him, still not fully understanding their shock. He met the devil, was it so hard to believe he met the opposite end of the spectrum too? Technically, I wasn't on the earth when I spoke to her. She brought me to Takamagahara, which I'm pretty sure is a sub-reality adjacent to the earth. You went to the heavens, Yoruichi shouted from beside him. Wait, you spoke with her in person. His father cried out at the same time. Stop, stop. Ichigo declared as he held out an open palm to both of them. You two are freaking me out. What are you going on about? Ichigo-kun, and it was Tessai's calm and deep voice that answered him. As we touched upon before, the great noble clans are firm followers of the old Shinto ways. But it is more than simple devotion that guides them. It is their history, their very ancestry. Ichigo's brows furrowed. When you say ancestry, Tessai continued. If you know of the curse, then you know of how the Soul King descended from the celestial heavens into the world of the dead. But with him went 5 immortal retainers, each personally appointed by Amaterasu-sama and ordained with new names for their selfless service. They're the progenitors of the 5 great noble clans, his father said quietly. Takamagahara is the ancestral seat of our families. It's our home. One which we haven't set foot in or seen in generations. Oh. That, he didn't know. He'd have to go back to Kyoto and ask Yusaka what she knew about those 5 immortals and what happened to them. Or even if they're still alive, for that matter. He briefly considered asking his father or Yoruichi, but something told him even they wouldn't have the answers. Especially given how tight-lipped matters were regarding the Soul King. What did you speak to her about? Yoruichi asked eagerly. Lots of things, really. He turned towards his father. She told me about when you and Mom visited the shrine in ice. Mom was pregnant with me at the time, but neither of you knew it. But she saw me, and she saw pieces of my future too. Ichigo looked at his father and the sheer awe and adoration the man had in his eyes. The not-so-small and devilish part of him wanted to elaborate on how temperamental and callous Amaterasu could be when it came to what she considered to be the betterment of her self-professed garden, just to see the look on his face. But at the same time, he gave the son its dues. Amaterasu, for all her impressive temper that was a match for his own, she really did love the people of Japan wholeheartedly. A sincere and true love that didn't have any pretenses. Millions upon millions of humans going about their lives in Japan, all she wanted was for them to be happy and safe. The second time I met her. Second time? Yoruichi interrupted with a disbelieving cry. Second time, Ichigo confirmed. The second time we met, she told me of Yomi's history. Of its ruler's death and the creation of hollows. Of the Soul King's valor and of his inevitable failure. She told me she wants to end his suffering so that he can finally put down his burden. And once and for all, fix the Shinto afterlife so that all souls may journey through death in peace and stability. Yoruichi collapsed into her chair and put her hands over her eyes. Her chest heaved and, as her shoulders trembled, she hunched over and placed her elbows onto her knees. She didn't forget. We weren't forgotten. she whispered softly. And with the obvious choke of emotion in her voice, Ichigo gently placed a hand on her back and began to rub soothing circles. We were the only ones who knew the truth, Isin said quietly. The only ones who knew of the disgrace that we weren't strong enough to help the Soul King claim all of Yomi for his rule. While the rest of the Sirete celebrated their victories and whatever they considered great accomplishments, we were the ones watching on from the shadows of our greatest failure. His father gave him a bitter look. That's what Soul Society is, you know. A constant reminder that we weren't good enough and of how we must struggle in perpetuity amidst our that failure. Imagine living in that kind of environment where you're brought up to be the best in a world you must view with utter contempt. Ichigo couldn't imagine it. Nor did he expect such harsh sentiments from his father and Yoruichi. All 5 clans have the same scroll painting deep within their ancestral vaults, his father murmured, his voice brimming with yearning. A painting of great wooden bridges that cross high over mountains and through seas of clouds as they brought together skies streaked with hues of pink and gold. Of the clearest rivers glimmering with crystal waters as the light hits them from high above. And they're filled with golden carp that jump out of the flowing streams and transform into great dragons that soar through the heavens. Of sakura trees whose leaves shimmer like the most beautiful silver and scatter starlight like diamonds for centuries, it's been the dream of the 5 great clans. That one day, Yoruichi's mournful voice carried over, we will return to our home bathed in her sunlight of gold. Chapter 26. What if? One full day. One full day had passed since his discussion with his father, Yoruichi, Urahara and Tessai. A full day since some truths were laid bare and others remained hidden. That was fine with him, he had planted the seeds he had meant to. This trip had been well worth it as he had received his closure from the many words said. Words from his father and words to his mother's grave. His sisters were safe and happy and all else was peripheral. He had no regrets. Only a desire to continue to move forward. Look forward. Move forward and never stop. You'll age if you pull back. You'll die if you hesitate. At the very least, he knew an inquisitive father or, even worse, an inquisitive Urahara would not come poking into matters of the underworld and possibly risk total dimensional collapse by some twisted quirk of fate. He had made his boundaries and set safe a distance. And now he could return to the underworld. To the new life he had built. To be Wrath once more. Ichigo stood on a towering skyscraper with his hands in his pockets and his neck craned back to look up at a facsimile of a reversed ocean, seated where the air should be. From within the sea above a single colossal upside-down ginkgo spread proud. Its golden leaves scattering through soft currents and falling towards the surface of the crystal blue ocean. And as they touched the rising and falling waves of the watered sky, they broke through with a ripple and danced in air of his soul. His gaze then fell sharply to the rest of the world, to the dozens of smaller urban towers of warped steel and glass that stood defiant and ominous. Between them ran raging rivers of black and crimson power, twisting and winding through the demon-wrought buildings. At the very side of the tide of demonic power, Ichigo could feel the starting of small irritation in the back of his mind that spread perversely, threatening to churn into whispered resentment. And before it could erupt and twist in total fury, he crushed the emotions back down to recess of his mind. And even as he did so, the black and crimson warp down below stilled and quieted, descending further down between the demonic edifices. Slowly, Ichigo set his sight on the horizon, where whole chunks of the Soul City were ripped away and entire buildings went hurtling into a colossal maelstrom of ash and fire that threatened to swallow this nonsensical world. And yet, as each fragment of the city was torn asunder, the size of the place never changed nor shifted. Merely continuing endlessly, as far as the eye could see. Still an eyesore, ain't it? Ichigo briefly glanced at the white manifestation of his soul before letting out a derisive snort. It's who I am now. Who we are. I guess that makes you an eyesore then, don't it? If anyone's the eyesore, it's you, he said with a dry twist. It's what you wanted though, ain't it? All the power and all the world to pick and choose from if you're ever spoiling for a fight. And I can feel it. Ha. Making nice with the kiddies and Shinigami don't do it. No, you need to be back down under, letting loose all those pesky emotions you thought you lost alongside your humanity. Those itty-bitty itchy feelings you've been tightly holding onto because of all the weak little humans. Can't let go otherwise they'd burn like weeds in the sun. Like living in a world of cardboard. Riles you, don't it? Ichigo rolled his eyes. Shut up, Zangetsu. Let me think in peace for once. Zangetsu snorted. Thinking never got you anywhere, king. Swinging me around sure as hell did. Ichigo gave Zangetsu an unimpressed look. Was that supposed to be a joke? It was. And it was fucking funny, Zangetsu said crossing his arms. Your sense of humor sucks, he responded dryly. I am you, his mirrored soul said with a feral grin. So, by default, your sense of human is the one that fucking sucks. Ichigo merely shook his head and went back to gazing into the vortex of hellfire. The hell you even doing in here, anyway? Zangetsu asked, coming to stand beside him. Trying to figure out how to make that sexy sensei in a hot spring fantasy you've had since you first learned Bankai reality without getting your ass whipped. Ichigo didn't even bother to dignify Zangetsu's provocations with a response. Instead, the glint in his eyes became stony as he continued to gaze deep into the first flame. Peering into fate. Not as easy as Tiamat makes it out to be. Then again, I'm not a crystallized consciousness of a preceptive nature. Zangetsu chuckled. Yeah, I can feel it too. Something's coming. Something big. And it's gonna happen damn soon. The world is moving, Ichigo quietly intoned. I can sense a fight coming. His soul sword's arm snaked around his neck, hanging loosely in an almost friendly manner, but Ichigo kept his sight firmly straight on hell. Oh, trust me, I know, Zangetsu laughed with dark glee as he patted Ichigo's shoulder good-naturedly. I'm just as excited as you are. And Ichigo's soul rang with maniacal laughter. He had not expected company for the evening, as Tiamat had, astonishingly enough, decided to spend time with his sisters and try to form some kind of understanding with them. He doubted friendship would blossom from a single conversation, but at the very least he hoped for civil tolerance. Even if it was begrudging. Thus, Ichigo had gone outside and onto the roof of his family home, laying down on the tiles with his arms behind his head. He kept his eyes closed as he turned his mind inwards, spiraling into his own soul. Trying to divine the eddies of fate was no easy thing, and he didn't have Tiamat's thousands of years of practice, nor her natural affinity with the world. If anything, his infernal nature made such a thing even more difficult, being the walking anathema he was. However, his eyes suddenly snapped open as he sensed a rapidly approaching Ryatsu, muted that it was. As his sight adjusted to the night sky illuminated by a waxing moon and stars, the outline of person materialized in his peripheral views. Fancy meeting you here, Yuichi said. Ichigo turned his head on the side, looking up her legs in those tight black leggings that so perfectly accented her curves, and met smiling amber eyes. Hey there. Mind if I join you? She asked, arching a playful eyebrow. Ichigo let out a low laugh. Sure. Grab some tile. Yuichi sat down close enough next to him that the occasional breeze carried over the tips of her ponytail to brush his own unruly hair. She drew up her knees, wrapping her arms around her legs, and rested her cheek on the top of her knees to look down at him. Her sharp eyes studied him carefully and, as the seconds ticked on, the laughter in them receded to a light melancholy. For what it's worth, she began softly, I'm sorry for how things turned out. He looked at her with surprise. Don't be, I'm not. But I am, she said resolutely, her gaze gaining an edge while retaining the touch of sadness. It's not an easy thing, having to leave behind everything you've known and loved for your whole life, due to things outside of your control. He opened his mouth to respond before promptly shutting it. Oh. Right. Yuichi would know. She didn't just leave her home, she was chased out of it. Well, his friends and family pushed him away out of well-meaning and not utterly unjustified concern. Yuichi was branded a traitor and criminal and actively had to flee from her own home. After gathering his thoughts, he summed them up shortly. I made a choice. We all do. Doesn't mean it's easy. He regarded her for a moment before answering, no, I suppose it doesn't. Yuichi slowly turned her head away, setting her eyes straight over the various houses of Karakura town. And Ichigo set his eyes back towards the night sky and luminous gibbous moon so far above. The comfortable silence fell over the two, and a soft breeze pushed her hair onto the edges of his face, surrounding him with the comforting scent of vanilla. His hands were heavy under his head, and dreams and temptations he had long forgotten began to resurface at the forefront of his mind. Tell me, her voice carried over, breaking him from his thoughts, what's the underworld like? He let out a thoughtful hum. There aren't any oceans like the earth, but there are plenty of inland seas and lakes. The skies are a deep purple in natural places. In other places, territory lords and powerful devils have altered it to mimic the earth and have even altered the flow of time to match the same 24 hours we have up here. Some places have more unique sights like burnt orange skies or vivid pink, filled with rainbow-colored shooting stars. Rainbow shooting stars. Her voice riddled with amusement and bafflement. His chest rumbled in humor. Seraphil and her own particular brand of aesthetics was an acquired taste, to say the least. What else? His mind went back to those first few months of wonder and discovery. Sky continents that float so far above the clouds you'd believe you could jump and touch the moon. Both of them. One shining so pure and white you'd think it was actually heaven, and the other riddled with so many active volcanoes that its surface is cracked with ravines of molten fire, making you wonder if it's hell itself. Deep below are caverns that extend on for thousands and thousands of miles. Some leading to chasms so great you could fit entire cities in them. Above, the lands are riddled with these megalopolises carefully planned and built in perfect geometric symmetry in emulation of runic circles to allow their ruling lords to cast powerful magic that can warp time and space itself. Hence the different skies and flow of time. There are jungles that can cover the expanse of an entire country and run so deep that, even with the magic and technology of devils, they've remained fully unexplored and undocumented. Some even theorize that the tremendous life energies of some jungles and forests, coupled with the latent magic of the underworld, has made the plant growth gain a collective state of semi-consciousness. Then there are these glass towers of. Ichigo cut himself off as he noted Yoruichi was staring at him with such a serene smile that it honestly threw him off. He'd never seen her make that expression before. Oh, sorry. I'm rambling, aren't I? She shook her head with a small laugh, sending her hair dancing in the moonlight. No. It's just that I've never heard you speak so much in one go before. And with so much passion too. Oh Lucifer. He was blushing. He was actually blushing. 2+ years of dealing with Tiamat and her antics, and, yet, Yoruichi could still reduce him to such a state with some words and a disarming smile. Real smooth Kurosaki. She gave him a warm look. You really are happy, aren't you Ichigo? The question surprised him, but Ichigo answered without any hesitation. Yeah. I am. And I'm happy for you too. And again, she set her gaze straight and away from him. Ichigo frowned and almost made to sit up, but honestly, he didn't know how to respond to that simple statement from her. His frown grew. I'd like to see it, she said. See what? This underworld of yours, she turned towards him with that same smile. It sounds quite beautiful. Some parts, yeah, he nodded. But then you start meeting some of the denizens and you realize how wild it really is. Like flowers the size of houses that release hallucinogen spores so you're distracted long enough for them to eat you. Dragons and devils that blow apart entire mountain ranges in petty arguments. Or these tentacle brain things that have this really weird obsession with that American movie Scarface. Sounds like quite a few adventures to be had, she purred. So, you let me tag along one day? He locked eyes with her and said seriously, anytime you want. She gave him a playful wink. It's a date then. She turned away from him again, and as the silence descended once more, Ichigo kept his eyes firmly on her and the moonlight illuminating her graceful frame. Several minutes passed like that, with him laying down and eyes firmly on her, while she looked out far off towards the night horizon. It was in that serene moment Ichigo realized just how deep his thoughts were filled of her, and just how much her presence in his life fully and truly meant to him. He had missed her. He had missed her a lot. She was a legitimate princess born to the highest nobility within her homeland. She had been destined to guide and shape Seoul society's future for centuries to come. But not just by virtue of birth. But by her own strength and power built through hundreds of battles and years upon years of struggle and strife. She could move with such elegance and agility where the eye couldn't be helped by be drawn to her movements up until her sheer mastery of foot techniques made one unable to keep up with her phenomenal speed. Yoruichi really was a remarkable woman. And for the briefest moment, his mind flashed to a single crimson piece that he could materialize at any moment he wished. Can I ask you something? He said, breaking the still silence between them. She raised one arm above her head while grabbing her elbow in a stretch. His eyes followed the curve of her back as it arched in the movement. Sure, what's up? Yoruichi straightened her legs and made to lay beside him, but she turned on her side instead of her back, with her head resting on one hand. Ichigo waited until she made herself fully comfortable. He held her gaze and without any indecisiveness asked, are you and Urahara together? Yoruichi's eyes widened and she froze perfectly still. The seconds sat impossibly heavy between them and briefly Ichigo wondered if he had crossed a line. And then she threw her back and began laughing wildly. What? She asked between deep laughs as she wiped at her eyes. Me and Kisuke. What on earth brought this about? He stared at her, taking in her raucous laughter and joy. Almost tempted to smile himself at the sight of her, Ichigo let out a breath instead and turned back towards the moon. Its pale light almost piercing to his eyes. I never did thank you, did I? He asked in lieu of answering her question. Thank me for what? She responded with laughter still echoing in her voice. For being my friend, he said heavily, turning back towards her. And it dawned on him then just how close their faces were to each other's. His gaze was momentarily drawn to her pouty lips in a still smile before that bouncing back up to her captivating eyes. Her laughter quickly died down and her eyes slightly widened once more. Though quick enough, the smile on her lips softened to one of fondness and mirth and the gold in her eyes shone with warmth. You don't have to thank me for that, Ichigo. Not ever. Yeah, I do, he said solemnly. After I lost my powers, after my dad pulled off his brilliant idea of trying to keep me safe, you were the one person who said fuck it. You still talked with me. You talked to me. Like I was still me. Not some porcelain doll that was stamped fragile, handle with care. Again, you don't need to thank me for that, she said warmly before shrugging and adding flippantly, besides, I'm really not all that good when it comes to listening to others. This kitty is a rebel through and through. And like I said, I do need to thank you for that, he insisted quietly. I don't think you understand how much that meant to me. Those afternoons you walked with me as I went home after school. Weekends where I'd just go to the park and you'd be there demanding I give you belly rubs. Suddenly, Ichigo's brows furrowed as he recalled other interactions, and the inflection of his voice changed as he vocalized them. Making me spend my part-time job money on special brushes to comb your fur with. Or making me buy an assortment of heavy creams and different brands of milk for you to drink from all across town, huh? Anyways, what I'm trying to say is, I think I would have gone insane without you. And I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done for me. Iruchi's smile was equal measures joy and sorrow as she reached out with one hand and ruffled his hair blithely. Ichigo did not stop her, and a not so small part of him wanted to lean into her touch. Though he kept himself and his rising emotions in check. I'll stand by what I said, you don't need to thank me. I got just as much out of our little hangouts as you did. But that still doesn't explain why you're suddenly wondering if Kisuke and I are together. Ichigo stared at her, taking in the lines and smooth curves of her face. The same face that had been his hope and joy through the final 2 years of high school. The smallness of her nose and its faint twitches that gave away her mood when she was agitated. The exotic color of her eyes that danced in sunlight and shone bright in shadows. The violet hues of her dark hair that were only made apparent when light struck it just right. He had missed her. Lucifer, he had missed her a lot. Because, he said, his voice strong and smooth even as he paused briefly. Because I was in love with you. Iruchi's hand in his hair stopped immediately and she gave a sharp intake of air. Her lithe body going deathly still. He kept his gaze locked onto her amber eyes, even as her pupils shrank and her eyes went wide. His enhanced hearing picking up the quickened pace of her pulse. Ever so slowly, she pulled her hand back, setting it down and pushing herself slightly up. She looked down at him, her expression such a perfect paradox of focus and bewilderment. What did you just say? She whispered. Ichigo gave her a sincere look. It was just a crush at first. Nothing serious. Started during the Bankai training when we invaded Soul Society. But, by the time I was in my last semester of high school, I'm pretty sure I was head over heels in love with you. The day that I graduated, I wanted to ask you out. She started down at him, her eyes flickering over his face in a fierce study. Astonishment and austerity marring her lips into a frown. You're serious? It wasn't a question, but he nodded in affirmation anyway. Her eyes narrowed. You were going to ask me out? That was a question. And through the tone of her voice, he inferred the second unsaid one. I was, he said with a shrug. And, obviously, I didn't. The reason why being typical hormonal teenage insecurity coupled with self-confidence chiseled away by well-meant stupidity. So, I caved. Iruchi kept staring at him in disbelief for several more seconds before breaking their shared gaze away to angrily mutter curses aimed at his father under her breath. And then I moved away, he continued with a laugh filled with self-deprecation. And wow, did I miss you. I missed you a lot. I spent a lot of nights thinking about you. Part of me kept saying, just go back. Just ask her out. Go to her next weekend. And another far more vocal part of me went, what would she even see in a kid like you? What could you offer a grown, adult woman? Why would she even look at you when? Kisuke, she supplied, finishing the point for him. He pressed his lips thinly and nodded. To which Iruchi let out a frustrated breath. She turned herself around and sat up with her hands in her lap, her head held down contemplatively, her chin touching her chest. And now? Her voice low and barely made out in the whisper of the night breeze, while her face remained utterly hidden from him. Ichigo pushed himself up and, much like how she was sitting before, raised his knees and put his arms around his legs. Now, I'm happy, he said, knowing full well she would understand what those two last words entailed. Iruchi didn't say anything, sitting perfectly still and quiet for several moments, though Ichigo noted how her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Several more tense moments passed before she let out a firm curse. I'm going to beat the shit out Isin. Ichigo dropped his eyes into his own lap, not sure what to say in this moment. He understood that this wasn't entirely fair to her, given he had years to think about this. Meanwhile, he had unloaded all of whatever this was onto her so suddenly. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Her hair fluttered in the wind as she shook her head. Her voice came out so soft and heartfelt, Ichigo's own heart nearly lurched in the moment, don't be. It's always better to know. Even if it pisses you off royally. Ichigo rolled his jaw. And as the wind carried the tips of her hair towards him, he reached out with one hand, allowing the wind to lightly brush violet strands against the back of his fingers. You'll always be my biggest what if. She snorted in derision and then let out a mock laugh. Ha. From friend to in love to what if. All in 5 minutes. You sure as hell know how to take a woman on an emotional roller coaster, kid. I'm sorry, he repeated. And he was. Iruchi let out a sigh and threaded both her hands through her hair. She then craned her head back and let loose a drawn-out and aggravated growl. Oorg. She ran both her hands over face before saying in soft tones, I've always loved Kisuke. Can't remember a time I never did, pain in my ass that he is. And yes. I've been with him many times over the centuries. A roll of emotions passed through him and Ichigo swallowed down the tightness in his chest. But it never went beyond comfort and companionship with him. Kisuke spends too much time in his own head to ever be able to commit to a relationship fully. Not a healthy one, at any rate. Ichigo ran a thumb over his shin absently, even as he acknowledged and appreciated the openness and honesty Uruchi was trusting him with. "We're just friends." He took in a deep breath through his nose and tore his eyes away from her. Staring hard at stars drifting in the dark sky. "Just friends." The words rang hollow in his head and his mouth went dry. How different would things have been had just one day, just one single day, he had mustered the courage to act out on his feelings back then. "You'll die if you hesitate." The whole potential future killed off. Ichigo smiled sadly to himself. What's done was done. No use crying over spilled milk. He had made his choices and he was determined to live by them. All of this was just fleeting regret. He had a life to return to soon enough, after all. Suddenly, he felt a warmth pressed to his side. As he looked down, his face morphed with surprise as he beheld Uruchi planted against him, her arms entwined with one of his as she put her head against his shoulder. Her face obscured behind the shadows cast by her long hair. "What if, huh?" she said faintly. He leaned his head against the top of hers. "What if," he murmured back to her. Uruchi's fingers crept up his wrists and palm until the pads of her fingers brushed against his and, slowly, their hands locked together. And like that, they sat under the moon and stars in a quiet sorrow. Each dreaming away of things that could have been and never were. Hours passed and neither of them said anything. Not that anything more needed to be said. Ichigo knew that they both fully understood what this moment that would inevitably be lost to time was. But they could make do. They were strong enough to. Ichigo turned his face into her hair. It would be so easy, so simple. All he had to was lower his head, turn his lips, and all those wants and whims from years past were his to be had. He could whisk her way to the underworld, hold the softness of her curves in his arms as he made her cry out his name in his bed. Again and again and again. He could hear her pulse like thunder in his ears. She wouldn't say no, he was sure of it. And even if she did. He closed his eyes, willing away dark thoughts and devilish inclinations. Surziches had told him long ago that temptation is a devil's greatest drug, but the trick is to peddle it, not partake in it. And Uruchi was a drug he could ill afford to taste. Not now. His grip on her hand tightened. The moon moved, the stars fell, and slowly the midnight majesties were dyed away in hues of dusted pink, soft blues and the emerging gold of the dawn. Uruchi raised her head, looking at the rising sun. "I should go," she said gently. Ichigo let out a breath of vexation, but he acknowledged that their night was over. He nodded to himself while brushing the back of her hand with his thumb. Uruchi responded with an affectionate squeeze. She stood slowly, pushing herself up with her one free hand and moved to undo their joined ones, but Ichigo gave a light tug and her amber eyes immediately jumped to meet his own. "Can I ask you another question?" he asked lightly. She gave an easy chuckle. It couldn't possibly lead to a heavier conversation than the last one, so sure. Ichigo's eyes fell to her knuckles. The skin over her deceptively delicate-looking bones was perfectly smooth, despite what he knew of her preference for hand-to-hand combat. He ran his thumb gingerly over them before meeting her gaze once more. "If I offered to make you a devil, what would you say?" Uruchi locked in place as if she were completely paralyzed before closing her eyes and letting out a heavy sigh. "Wow, I was wrong. I was dead wrong." Her eyes snapped back open. She narrowed them and he could slightly make out a lick of irritation. "And you seriously need to stop dropping these bombs on me. My heart's going to explode at the rate you're going." Ichigo merely offered her an apologetic smile. Uruchi let out another sigh and ran her free hand through her ponytail. She then looked at him dead in the eye and said sincerely, "I'm a born and bred Shinigami. And I've been one for a long time. Just because we leave some things behind, that doesn't mean we have to turn our backs on them completely. We all make choices, Ichigo. And what if," he began slowly, "I could promise you anything you wanted?" Her lips curved roguishly. "Can you promise me heaven?" He froze even as her words registered in his mind. And then he threw back his head and roared with laughter. He laughed harder than he had in a very long time. His entire body shaking with cheerful tremors as he held onto her hand. Yeah, there was no way she would have made it easy for him. She always pushed him to the impossible. Whether it was learning Bankai in 3 days or having him travel across cities for a specific brand of cream he had never even heard of before. That's the Uruchi he knew. That's the Uruchi he. "No, I guess I can't," he laughed. "Tell you what," she said with a cheeky smile, "ask me again in 100 years. Maybe I'll have changed my mind by then." He looked up at her as the rising sun framed itself behind her perfectly, lighting up her silhouette and giving that dark skin of hers a warm and golden shine. She was so beautiful, so utterly, breathtakingly beautiful. She looked down at him with naked emotion, her eyes conveying everything that had gone said and unsaid in their chaste night together. And then her fingers slipped away, his hand falling away from her touch. "Goodbye, Ichigo." Goodbye Yuruchi. And she was gone in a flash. Isin sat at the breakfast table, having gotten up earlier than usual. His daughters were just rousing and would soon begin the start of their morning routine in preparation of school. As for his son, Isin threw a glance at the stairs as the tall young man walked down, his eyes shadowed by his long bangs. "Morning Dad," he said in a quiet, almost mournful tone. Isin regarded him with a cool nod and returned to reading the morning paper while he ate his eggs. As his son shuffled through the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cabinet and opening the refrigerator to pull out a carton of orange juice, Isin gave the boy a hard glance from the sides of his eyes. "You know," he said, returning his eyes to the paper. "In another time, in another place, you would have been born with a Shiba name. There were talks at the time before I left between our family and the Shiman. There would have been a decent chance that you would have been engaged and married off to her." Though he couldn't see his son from behind his newspaper, he could sense the boy had paused in his step. And then an annoyed voice carried over, "I forgot how fond you were of eavesdropping." "Nothing of the sort," Isin said gingerly as he flipped the page. "Though, for future reference, if you plan on spending the whole night talking with a pretty girl, try not to do it right outside your father's window. At my age, I need all the sleep I can get." "Duly noted." His son's voice dripped dryly. A few seconds later said, "You know, there's a good chance she's going to kick your ass." Isin took a sip of his coffee. "And I'd let her too." As Ichigo sat at the table and started his breakfast, Isin was at the end of his. Though he ate much slower than his son, given most of his attention was spent on the paper rather than his meal. After several quiet moments in the kitchen, his son finally broke the silence. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah?" "How strong of a Quincy was Mom?" Isin's hands momentarily clenched, crumpling the paper under them before relaxing and letting his grip loosen. He already knew where this conversation was heading. "Strong enough to handle most any hollow," he said plainly, taking another sip of his morning coffee before returning to the paper. "Could give any lieutenant from the Gate 13 a sound beating, will even compete with some of the lower-end captains without them using their bankai." He heard his son sigh. "I was gonna ask you last night, but I figured it'd be better to wait until we were alone, but how did that damn thing manage to kill Mom if she was that strong?" "It's a long story, son. And your sisters will be down in about 10 to 15 minutes. Talk fast then," his son said simply. Isin let out a sigh as he folded the newspaper and put it down. He looked into Ichigo's brown eyes and said gravely, "It's an old Quincy legend about a sealed king." 3 days later, things were awry. Tiamat could feel it in the very bones of the earth. The tides of fate churned almost violently these days. Infuriatingly enough, while she could peer into the greater depths of the future, too much of it was diluted by greater immortal powers. There was no definiteness nor any greater probability of occurrence. The future was moving far too randomly, and with it, it brought a primeval familiarity. Things that were best left in slumbering dreams were rousing, and they would soon cross over the folds of reality into this world. She frowned. She could sense herself and her beloved in the waters of destiny. A battle was coming, though in what capacity she was unsure. She looked over to him, even as she held his hand as they walked the streets of the human world. His promise to procure ice cream for his 2 sisters had been left unfulfilled. Now, many days passed, she had convinced him to make true of his words and had him bring his 2 sisters on an outing with him. Naturally, she too would receive her fair share of the frozen and sweetened delight. Her lips parted slightly at the thought of what awaited. Cookies and cream. "You're salivating," he laughed teasingly from beside her. She threw him a fierce look. "As if I would ever do something so primitive." Big bad Tiamat loses her mind at the thought of ice cream. "You are so damn cute, sometimes." She growled low in her chest. She would bite him again were it not for, hello. Yuzu and I are right here. Can you not flirt so blatantly? Have some shame you too." The dark-haired sister said, her voice dripping with exasperation. Tiamat bit back a reply as her master turned around and gave them a scowl. "Who told you to watch? Third wheels can avert their eyes." "Ani-chan, you meanie," Yuzu exclaimed with a pout. "How can you call your own sisters third wheels? Besides, you were the one who invited us out after you forgot to get us ice cream the first time around." He rolled his eyes, but the laughter in them was all too apparent. "Alright, I'm sorry. It was joke, don't take it too seriously." She looked at him, carefully taking note of the ease that had set its way on his mien. His 2 younger sisters had that effect on them. Their presence and antics always gave solace to his heart. And such consolation was much needed for him. The conversations from his father and the little psychopomps that resided on the other side of this town had mentally exhausted him. Even worse was the latter conversation with his father the day after, on his mother's death and its manner. The devil in him burned strong that night. And there was only so much their love-making could do alleviate his rage and burning desire for vengeance. Though that did not mean she did not try. Some nameless island far off the coast of this country had been sunk into the sea as he had attacked her body in savage love. What was that word he was so fond of? Ah yes. Fucking. They had fucked that night. And neither the storms she summoned nor the tidal waves from his brutality had been enough to quell his thirst for violence. He needed to return to the underworld, back into the folds of familiar darkness, where he would no longer be forced to hold back his true nature. He could chain his sin for so long, after all. Speaking of ice cream, Karen said, shaking Tiamat away from her musings, you're paying, right? He stopped mid-stride, and she looked at him curiously as he threw his sister an offended look. Of course, I'm paying. What kind of bum do you think I am? You think I'd invite somebody out only to have them pay? Says the guy who gifted a gift. Her lips twitched with amusement as his expression turned bewildered and he exclaimed angrily, are you still going on about that? Fine. I'll buy you both something else to make up for it. But I like the God, Yuzu protested lightly. It's very pretty. Tiamat turned towards the two with a faint smile. You would do well to take advantage of his generosity. If he says he will gift you whatever you wish for, then he will do so. You would be surprised to know how much pull you have on him. I'd be content if they didn't, he said dryly from beside her. They had arrived at the quaint little ice cream vendor and Tiamat noted her table of preference was occupied by other mortals. With a quick mental command, the humans' eyes glazed over and they took their things and began walking away. You're unbelievable, her love whispered with exasperation. Though she heeded him not and set her long skirt straight as she sat down on the metal chairs. As the twin girls each took a seat next to each other and opposite of her, she gave him a pointed look. I guess that means I'm ordering, he said helplessly while taking in the sight of the three seated ladies. What was it again? Cookies and cream for the Tiamat. Vanilla with Oreos, M&Ms and sprinkles for Yuzu. And plain vanilla for Karen. Tiamat said nothing, knowing full well he could simply take the information from her mind, but she watched with amusement as the light-haired one nodded her head enthusiastically. The dark-haired one was on her phone and distractedly said, soft vanilla, itchy nai. She kept herself from shaking her head. Mortals and their obsessions with their tools. The simplest way to distract a human was to give it a new toy to play with and watch them forget the rest of the world in their childish wonder. Right, her beloved said as he scratched the back of his head and turned to go order their ice cream. Take your time. He did say not anything back, but she felt his warmth seep through her mind in confirmation of her wish. She watched him walk away, her eyes briefly falling to his backside. As he walked into the shop, she turned towards the two young girls. No, it was unfair of her to claim them mere girls, they had both passed well beyond the cusp of womanhood now. But a mere 100 years ago, it would not have been unusual for women of their age to be married off and birth children. So, Tiamat-san, her eyes jumped to the light-haired one Yuzu and took note of how the girl did not flinch away from her gaze this time. Though, that had less to do with the girl's own growing mental fortitude and more to do with Tiamat's discipline. Irksome that it was to do so. The oceans were not meant to be restrained. What is it that you do? She lifted a perfectly manicured hand and set her chin resting in her palm. You will have to elaborate. The teenage girl flushed. Oh, I was just wondering what you do for a career. Sorry, I should have been clear. You need not apologize, she said, her lips quirking with amusement. Unlike the dark-haired one, this one became flustered all too easily. As to your question, I have no profession. Nor do I possess any formal education of any kind. The other twin perked up at her words, looking at her with surprise as she put away her phone. You never went to school. I did not, she responded, a teasing delight coloring her voice. I was born in a very harsh place, in an equally harsh time. There were no school nor universities nor any sort of places of learning. One had to live off the world, lest the world decide to live off you. Both young women's eyes widened even further. Karen's brows furrowed and she asked, then how do you live without any sort of income? I have wealth, she said simply. None that I care for, but I have it nonetheless. I spent my years traveling from place to place, taking in the beauty of the natural world. Making new memories and reliving old ones. Yet, those days are gone for me. They both looked at her curiously. What do you mean? You don't like to travel anymore? Yuzu asked. I adore travel, she smiled at them. But I love him more. And the memories I make with him are all the more precious to me for it. In a few years, I imagine, when his life is more settled and he is sure of his place of this world, I will look forward to traveling the land with him. I am quite sure we will have great fun. Till the end of time, Tiamat. Warmth blossomed in her chest and she smiled to herself despite his sisters being right before her. Karen blinked up at her, the young woman's eyes not holding any hostility for the first time. You really love him, don't you? More than I can put into words, she said in equal measures of conviction and passion. He has made me happier than I have been in a very, very long time. After a long pause, Yuzu's lips parted. Thank you. Tiamat regarded her carefully. For what? For making our brother happy, Karen answered in turn, and then Yuzu began to speak again. He's an idiot. Ani-chan is a class A idiot. He'll take on everyone's problems and carry them around like they were his to begin with, but when it comes to his own issues, he'll keep his mouth shut and suffer in silence. Because he doesn't want others to be worried for him. He thinks having others worry for him means he's just being a burden. So, he just locks it all up inside and keeps on pretending everything is fine. After Mom died and Tiamat's heart lurched at those 3 words from Karen, Ichinai did his best to take care of us. Dad was busy running the clinic and trying to fill an empty spot he never could. Ichinai didn't want to bother Dad, so tried solving everything on his own. And he just got used to it. Tiamat's gaze fell to the dull metal table. She knew this, of course. Having gleaned it all from his memories that she dreamed in countless nights spent in his arms. Nevertheless, to hear of it from these 2 young ones and the anguish in their eyes and voice, how could she not be moved? What was more sacred than the love between mother and child? And to have it wrenched away so violently at such a young age. You gonna adopt them? Tiamat had to keep herself from rolling her eyes, even as she prodded hard at him within the confines of their shared mindscape. Must you be so indifferent to their worries? I would prefer it not being there to begin with. That aside, I'm coming out now. She heard the falls of feet even as the door to the shop jingled with his exit. Sorry for the wait, the line in there was surprisingly long. He said with the same cool inflection as before he had left. He placed a brown paper bag at the center of the table and took out 1 cup of ice cream at a time, matching each flavor to the person who desired it. Napkins and spoons are in the bag, he said as he sat down next to her. So, what were you guys talking about? The twins were caught off guard, but Tiamat smoothly said, we were conversing about professions. Though I am unfamiliar with this country's ways, I know that they are soon to join college within the year, yes. Oh? He rose a curious brow even as he tore the plastic covering from his spoon and dipped it into his own chocolate ice cream. You guys have decided what your college majors are going to be. They both quickly compassed themselves and nodded in unison, happily declaring, pre-med. She didn't need their bond to feel his surprise, it was as clear as day on his face. Pre-med. What happened to being a school teacher and making the women's national team? Still in synchronity, they rolled their eyes together. We grew up, Ichinai, in case you haven't noticed. We're not 10 years old anymore, Ani-chan. Huh. Tiamat did enjoy his baffled look. It made him look rather adorable. So, what changed your minds? Because people get hurt, Karen said so factually and clinically that she could feel him reel from the words. And no matter how hard you try, you can't stop them from getting hurt. But what you can do, Yuzu continued in place of her sister, is try to help them get better. So, that they're not hurting anymore. Tiamat's eyes danced with laughter as his mouth fell open and he stared at the 2 young women in wonder. Under the table, she reached out and put a hand on his thigh and he immediately grabbed onto it. You should be proud of them. I am. That's a very mature outlook, he said after a moment as his lips moved in a full smile. I'm very proud of you too. They both beamed up at him. And I am proud of you, beloved. That you would inspire them to such nobility, even if it was through that ridiculously stubborn stupidity of yours. She could see the faint blush dust his cheeks as he grouched back to her, just eat your damn ice cream before it melts. Tiamat's laughter rang through both their minds. Things were awry. Right now. Tiamat sat in his bed, staring out of his window and up at the moon, now full and radiating immortal precepts as it had since time immemorial. Invisible to all but those who had the arcane eye for the ebb and flow of the natural world. What's wrong? Her love sat at his desk, tapping away at his laptop. They had returned from their outing, it having lasted much longer than anyone of them would have anticipated. But it was a necessary thing for him to reaffirm his bonds with his sisters and for her to build bonds to begin with. When they had passed through the threshold of the family home, as the night blanketed the sky, he had set himself to dealing with matters of the underworld. I am unsure, she said slowly as she drew her legs up onto the bed and put them under the covers, never taking her eyes off the glowing moon. I cannot see it clearly, but there is a coming catalyst. The turning point of a new age. Moments passed, the shifting of the bed beneath her made her tear her gaze away from the lunar light to find that he had come to sit next to her, his eyes filled with concern. He reached up to cup her cheek and she instinctively nuzzled into his palm, relishing in the heat of his demonic flesh seeping into her own. In a roundabout manner, it was comforting to her. Hey, we'll be fine. Everything will be fine, he said gently as he leaned in to kiss her lips. She smiled sadly at him. That promise is not in your power to keep. This may be a small thing now, but it will lead to a great upheaval. One that will bring about a cataclysm if not properly contained. I have seen it before, beloved. I saw it before I was betrayed. I saw it again just before the morning star fell from his lofty place, ushering the advent of the 3 great factions and the inevitable Great War. And last I witnessed it, it heralded the outrage of the heavenly dragons and the millions of deaths there reaped on that battlefield in their final moments, forcing the Great War to a fiery close. His brown eyes remained resolute even as he ran his thumb gently across her cheek. We'll be fine. His repeated words were reinforced with the conviction that flowed from his mind. Her smile grew even more mournful and said as much as she asked, "Hold me." And he drew her into his arms and Tiamat collapsed against his chest. Fully melding into his embrace and pressing her head to where his heart would be. He rubbed her back, using the edges of his nails to trace soothing circles up and down her spine, the way she enjoyed so much. As she pressed herself even closer to him, she let out a deep purr and kissed his chest. Even through all the uncertainty of the coming future, the one definiteness she had in the encroaching madness was him. The devil who was also her heart and home. "I love you. I love you too, beautiful." He said and she felt him plant a firm kiss to the top her head. She stayed there in his arms for several minutes, content to keep her eyes closed against him. And, though she knew there were things that he wanted to do, she was just selfish enough to hold him here and have them both fall asleep in the moment. And then his phone rang. Tiamat's eyes snapped open furiously and she let loose a low, rumbling growl. He let out a small laugh as she felt his waist twist in her arms as he sought out his phone. "I'm sure it's nothing, it's probably just air, it's Yusaka." "Of course." The growl erupted into a full-blown snarl as she bared her fangs, but he immediately grabbed her head and pushed her head into his abdomen, muffling her. "Are you crazy?" he whispered harshly. "My dad already knows, but my sisters definitely do not." "Fine, fine." She jerked away from him. "Go talk with the gold vermin." He hesitated for a slight second before flicking his thumb across his phone and putting it to his ear. "Hey there, princess," and he disappeared from the folds of space and she felt him reappear several dozen meters above the house. In truth, she had come to tolerate the nine-tailed fox, but Tiamat was a dragon and she had pride in spades. She highly doubted she would ever come to consider Yusaka a close friend. Allies, yes. But not a friend. At least not in the coming centuries. And with that thought, her mood soured even more. He was a devil, not matter his young mind which still clung onto the last vestiges of humanity within him. And devils and monogamy did not pair well together. He was already living that. In the next several centuries to come, perhaps even as soon as within the next coming decade, she would not be surprised if a third paramour climbed into his bed. And then there would another and another after that, and so on. Such was the way of things. Especially with how absurdly gifted he was when it came to unintentionally making women fall in love with him. Never mind that he had an appealing face and physical form, his forwardness, his lack of indecisiveness, his protective streak and the absolute oceans of power that dwelt in him, he was beyond appealing to many of the supernatural. She let out a frustrated growl. Still silently cursing Yusaka deep within the confines of her own mind. More than anything, Tiamat had been enjoying her moment in her lover's arms. That it was interrupted by his other woman only made it all the more grating. About to entertain her grumblings with imagined scenes of violence, Tiamat's breath suddenly froze cold in her throat as panic and terror slammed into her heart. Eyes going wide, her hand immediately went to her chest and the rapidly increasing beat of her heart pounding beneath her ribs. No. This fear wasn't hers. It was his. "Beloved," she whispered with trepidation. Instantly Tiamat reached out with her mind, but she was met with such a cacophony of raging emotions and chaotic thoughts that she was momentarily overwhelmed. "What on earth has the golden fool said to him?" About to tear through the fabric of space to go to him, he suddenly materialized back into his bedroom, his eyes wild and alarm radiating off of him in spades. "We need to go. Now." Despite his obvious fear, the iron tone of authority crept into his voice. Tiamat leapt out of bed, soothingly reaching out and grabbing both his shoulders in a comforting rub. "Beloved, what has happened?" His eyes jumped from place to place as he gathered his thoughts and ran a frustrated hand through his hair, though he was so vexed in the moment he forgot he's still holding his phone, so he ended up dragging the glass through his locks. "Something's gone wrong, Takamagahara's barriers around the country were deactivated. And Kakabeel, a fucking cadre, entered Japan along with entire legions of fallen numbering in the tens of thousands. Takamagahara is mustering its armies, but to make matters worse, that lunatic is heading straight to Kuo Academy, where Surzich's and Sarah's sisters are currently living." Tiamat hissed. He'll either hold them hostage or kill them outright and enrage Surzich's and Sarah into launching an all-out war of vengeance. "Yeah, exactly. And you want to know what the icing on the cake is?" he said without any humor. "Kakabeel stole the Excalibur fragments from the church and is using them as bait. Uriel is leading his personal legions across the sea even as we speak to reclaim them. We're on the brink of an immortal war." "No," she breathed in horror. "Mortals would die in droves if this place becomes a battlefield. The boundaries of life and death will inevitably fall, the realms of the living and dead will spill over onto each other." He rubbed his temples vigorously. "On top of everything this week, I now need to stop a fucking apocalypse. Worst vacation ever. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.